At the crowded spring baptism, Elara Morn stood frozen at the church entrance, her baby boy wrapped tight against her chest, watching families fill the pews in pairs, husbands beside wives, fathers beside mothers. The priest's words still burned in her ears. Without a father or male guardian present, I cannot proceed with the blessing. Her cheeks flamed as dozens of eyes turned toward her, their judgment sharp as winter frost. In that moment of crushing humiliation, she made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. She turned toward the shadows at the back of the church, where a solitary figure stood apart from the crowd, and asked a question that no respectable widow should ever ask a stranger. Before we begin this story of courage, sacrifice, and unexpected love, I invite you to stay with me until the very end, and please, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel across the world. The Church of the Sacred Heart had never looked more beautiful or more cruel. Spring sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, painting the worn wooden pews in shades of amber and rose. The air smelled of beeswax candles and the wild lilacs that Mrs. Ashford had arranged in clay vases along the altar. Every family in the valley had turned out for the baptism service, the first of the season, a celebration of new life after the long, bitter winter that had taken so many. Elara Morn had prepared for this day for weeks. She'd sewn a small white gown from the remnants of her own wedding dress, staying up late by candlelight, her fingers cramping around the needle. She'd saved coins from selling eggs and the herbs she grew in her garden, enough to pay for the blessing. She'd washed her hair in rosemary water and pinned it beneath her widow's bonnet, trying to look respectable, trying to look like she belonged among the other mothers. Her son Thomas, 8 months old, with his father's dark curls and her own gray eyes, had been fussy all morning, sensing perhaps his mother's nervousness. But now, wrapped in the christening gown, he'd finally settled against her shoulder, his small fist curled in the fabric of her black mourning dress. Black. Always black. It had been 14 months since the fever took her husband, Henry, and still the town expected her to wear the color of grief like a brand. Elara had arrived early, hoping to slip into a pew near the back, to go unnoticed among the crowd. But as family after family filed past her, she began to understand that something was wrong. The Hawthorns, who lived just down the road, averted their eyes as they passed. Mrs. Sullivan clutched her husband's arm tighter, whispering something behind her gloved hand. The Brennan boys, usually so friendly, suddenly found the floor fascinating. When Elara finally gathered the courage to step toward an empty pew, Mrs. Ashford, the minister's wife, a woman whose charity was as legendary as her judgment, placed a firm hand on the pew's edge. "I'm sorry, dear," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice pitched low, but not low enough. "These seats are reserved for the baptism families." "I am a baptism family," Elara replied, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling that had started in her hands. "I'm here for Thomas's blessing." Mrs. Ashford's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flickering to the baby and then away, as if the sight of him caused her pain. "Yes, well, about that. Reverend Ashford will need to speak with you before the ceremony begins. Perhaps you should wait in the vestibule." The vestibule. The place where latecomers stood, where the drunk and the disorderly were asked to wait until they could comport themselves properly. Elara's cheeks burned, but she nodded and turned away, feeling the weight of every gaze in that church pressing against her back like physical hands, pushing her toward the door, pushing her out. She stood in the vestibule for 20 minutes, listening to the organ music swell, listening to the congregation sing the opening hymn. Thomas began to fuss again, hungry and confused, and she rocked him gently, humming under her breath, trying to calm him, trying to calm herself. When Reverend Ashford finally appeared, his face was grave with the kind of regret that comes too easily to those who have never truly suffered. "Mrs. Morn," he began, and even his voice was wrong, too gentle, too pitying. "I'm afraid there's been a complication with Thomas's baptism." "What complication?" Elara asked, though some part of her already knew, some part of her had known since the moment Mrs. Ashford refused her a seat. "The sacrament of baptism requires the presence of both parents, or in the case of unfortunate circumstances, a male relative or guardian who can stand in the father's stead, to speak for the family, to take responsibility for the child's spiritual upbringing." Elara stared at him. "I'm his mother. I'm his family." Of course, of course. Reverend Ashford's hands fluttered in a gesture that might have been meant as comforting, but felt only dismissive. No one questions your devotion, Mrs. Morn, but the church has protocols, standards that must be maintained. Surely you have a brother, an uncle, even your late husband's father. My brother is in Boston, has been for 3 years. My husband's parents died before we married. There is no one. Then perhaps, the Reverend said slowly, it would be best to wait. Until that is, until your circumstances have changed, until there is a man in your household who can properly represent. You want me to marry again before you'll baptize my son? Ilara's voice cracked on the words, too loud in the small space. That's what you're saying? That my child can't receive God's blessing unless I have a husband? Mrs. Morn, please keep your voice down. He's 8 months old, 8 months, and I've been waiting for the spring baptism like everyone else, like you told me to do. I understand your distress, but you must understand the position the church is in. There are rules, traditions. Traditions, Ilara laughed, and it came out bitter and sharp. My husband died serving this community. He died bringing medicine through the snow to the Cooper family when half their children had the fever. He died being the good Christian man everyone said he was. And now you're telling me that his son, isn't worthy of baptism because there's no man standing beside me. Reverend Ashford's face had gone red. Behind him, Ilara could see faces peering around the doorframe. Mrs. Sullivan, the Brennan mother, others whose names she'd once known, who'd once welcomed her into their homes. Now they stared at her like she was something shameful, something to be whispered about behind closed doors. Perhaps, the Reverend said stiffly, we should discuss this at another time. When you've had a chance to calm yourself and think rationally about— I am thinking rationally. Ilara's voice broke entirely now, tears hot in her eyes. I'm thinking that my son deserves the same blessing as every other child in this church. I'm thinking that faith shouldn't depend on whether there's a man in the house. I'm thinking that you're a hypocrite, Reverend, and that this church is full of them. The gasps from the doorway were audible even over Thomas's sudden crying. Ilara clutched her son closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, her whole body shaking with rage and humiliation and grief that had no bottom. Mrs. Morn, Reverend Ashford said coldly, all pretense of gentleness gone now, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're causing a disturbance during a holy service, and I cannot— I'll leave. Ilara's voice came out flat, drained of everything except a bone-deep weariness. But you'll answer to God for this. You all will. She turned toward the door, toward the spring sunlight that suddenly seemed too bright, too mocking. She made it 3 steps before her legs nearly gave out beneath her. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. She'd done everything right. Everything they'd told her to do. She'd mourned properly, dressed properly, kept her head down and her mouth shut for 14 months. She'd raised her son alone, working herself to exhaustion, and never once asked these people for charity or pity. And still, it wasn't enough. Still, they looked at her and saw only what was missing. Who was missing? The doorway to the church proper was just ahead, and beyond it she could see the congregation settling back into the pews, preparing to continue with the baptisms. The Hawthorne's twin girls, the Sullivan baby, the Brennan youngest, all of them with 2 parents standing proud, all of them welcomed, blessed, accepted. Ilara stopped walking. She stood there in the vestibule, Thomas's cries echoing off the stone walls, her own breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. She could leave, should take her son and go back to their cabin in the woods and never set foot in this church again. But if she left now, Thomas would never be baptized. The other children would grow up blessed and welcomed into the community, and her son would be marked as different, as less. As the widow's bastard, that's what they'd call him, even though he was born properly in wedlock. That's what they'd whisper when he started school, when he tried to court a girl, when he tried to build a life in this valley. The sins of the mother visited upon the son. Unless— Ilara's gaze drifted past the empty vestibule, past the doorway where Mrs. Sullivan and the others still lingered like vultures, to the very back of the church where the shadows pooled thick beneath the balcony. There was a man standing there. She'd noticed him earlier when she'd first arrived, a tall figure in a worn work coat standing apart from the families, his back to the wall as if he preferred the darkness to the light. She'd paid him little attention then, focused as she was on her own mission, but now she looked at him properly. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and solid in the way of men who worked with their hands. Dark hair, longer than was fashionable, touched his collar. His face was rough-hewn and weathered, with the deep tan of someone who spent his days outside. He had his arms crossed over his chest, and his eyes, even from this distance, she could see they were a startling blue, were fixed not on the altar or the ceremony preparations, but on her. He'd been watching her argue with the Reverend. He'd seen everything. Most men would have looked away by now, embarrassed to be caught staring, or perhaps eager to distance themselves from her disgrace. But this man held her gaze steadily, his expression unreadable. Alara knew who he was, though she'd never spoken to him. Everyone in the valley knew of Rowan Blake, the lumberjack who lived alone on the mountain, who came down to town only to sell timber and buy supplies. He was a fixture at the edges of valley life, present but not part of it, seen but not known. They said he'd come from back east 5 or 6 years ago, after some tragedy no one could quite name. They said he was a hard worker, honest in his dealings, but cold, distant. A man who preferred trees to people. They said he'd never married, never courted, never showed interest in anything except his work. And now he was the only person in this entire church who was looking at Alara Morn without judgment in his eyes. The idea came to her all at once, terrible and desperate and utterly insane. What if? Alara's heart began to pound again, but this time not with humiliation, with something wilder, more dangerous. A plan forming before she could think it through, before reason could stop her. Reverend Ashford wanted a man beside her? Fine, she'd give him a man. Before she could lose her courage, before she could remember all the reasons this was madness, Alara turned and walked straight toward the back of the church, toward the shadows, toward Rowan Blake. The few people still lingering near the vestibule fell silent, watching her with wide eyes. She heard someone whisper, "What is she doing?" But she didn't stop, didn't slow. Rowan Blake's eyes tracked her approach, his expression shifting from neutral observation to something like wariness. He straightened slightly as she came closer, uncrossing his arms, his body language suddenly alert, defensive. Alara stopped 3 feet away from him, close enough to speak quietly, too far for impropriety. Thomas had quieted against her shoulder, perhaps sensing the change in her heartbeat, the shift in her intention. Up close, Rowan Blake was even more imposing than she'd realized. He towered over her by nearly a foot, his shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the doorway. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who'd spent years swinging an axe. But his eyes, meeting hers directly for the first time, were not cold. They were careful, guarded, the eyes of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from people. "Mr. Blake," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to ask you something." He didn't respond, just waited, watching her. God help her. God forgive her. "I need you to do something for me," she continued, dropping her voice to barely above a whisper. "Something that will sound strange, possibly scandalous. But I swear to you, I have no ill intentions, and I'm not trying to trap you into anything you don't want." One of his eyebrows rose slightly, the closest thing to a reaction she'd gotten. Alara took a breath. "The Reverend won't baptize my son without a father or male guardian present. I have no one, no family close enough, no one who can stand with me. But if you were willing—" The words stuck in her throat, too absurd to speak aloud. "If I what?" His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough with disuse, as if he didn't speak often enough to keep it smooth. "If you would pretend," Alara forced out, "just for today, just for the ceremony, if you would stand beside me and pretend to be Thomas's father or his guardian, just long enough for the blessing." Rowan Blake stared at her. The silence stretched so long that Alara's courage began to crack, shame flooding in to fill the spaces where desperate hope had been. "I know it's an outrageous request," she said quickly, "and I have no right to ask it of you. We're strangers. You owe me nothing, but I have no one else to turn to. And my son, He deserves this blessing. He deserves to be welcomed into this community, even if I'm not. And all it would take is 5 minutes of your time, 5 minutes of standing beside me and saying nothing. Afterward, you can leave, and I'll never bother you again. I'll tell everyone it was a temporary arrangement, that you were doing a Christian kindness, nothing more. Your reputation won't be— Yes. Alara's words died in her throat. What? I'll do it. Rowan Blake's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if she'd asked him to help carry firewood, not to claim a child that wasn't his. I'll stand with you. She stared at him, searching his face for mockery, for cruelty, for any sign that this was a joke at her expense. But his expression remained serious, those blue eyes steady on hers. You will? That's what you asked, isn't it? Yes, but— Alara shook her head, trying to clear the fog of shock. Mr. Blake, do you understand what I'm asking? People will talk. They'll make assumptions about us, about Thomas. They might think that you and I— People always talk. He said it simply, as if it were a fact of nature, like rain or snow. Doesn't matter much what they say. It might matter to you, later. When— Mrs. Morn— He cut her off gently, but firmly. Do you want my help or not? And there it was. The simple question, stripped of all the complications she was trying to heap onto it. Did she want this? Did she want to walk back into that church with this strange, solitary man beside her and claim him as family, even falsely? Thomas stirred against her shoulder, making a small sound of contentment. His tiny hand gripped the fabric of her dress, trusting completely in her to make the right choice. Yes, Alara whispered. Yes, I want your help. Rowan Blake nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then he did something that shocked her more than his agreement. He held out his arms. May I? For a moment, Alara didn't understand. Then she realized he was asking to hold Thomas. You don't have to. If I'm meant to be his father, even for pretend, it'll look strange if I don't hold him. His logic was unassailable, but still Alara hesitated. She'd let no one hold Thomas except herself since Henry died. No one. The midwife, Mrs. Chen, had tried once, and Alara had nearly snapped her head off. The thought of giving her son to a stranger, even for a moment. But Rowan Blake's hands remained outstretched, patient and steady, and his eyes met hers with something that might have been understanding. Slowly, carefully, Alara shifted Thomas from her shoulder and passed him into those large, scarred hands. Rowan took the baby with surprising gentleness, settling him into the crook of one arm as naturally as if he'd done it 100 times before. Thomas blinked up at him, his small face scrunching in confusion at this new face, this new scent. Then, impossibly, Thomas smiled. It was his first real smile at a stranger, and he gave it to Rowan Blake in the shadows of the church, his small hand reaching up to pat clumsily at Rowan's rough jaw. Something flickered across Rowan's face, so fast that Alara almost missed it. Pain. Raw and ancient, and quickly buried beneath that careful blankness. But she'd seen it, and in that moment, she wondered what tragedy had brought Rowan Blake to this valley, what loss he carried that made him understand hers. We should go, Rowan said quietly, his voice even rougher than before they start without us. Alara nodded, not trusting her voice. Together, they walked back toward the vestibule, toward the doorway where Mrs. Sullivan and the others still lingered. The women's expressions shifted from curiosity to shock to scandalized delight as they took in the sight of the widow Morn walking beside the hermit Lumberjack, a baby in his arms. Alara Morn, what are you? Mrs. Sullivan began, but Alara walked past her without acknowledgement, following Rowan toward the church proper. Reverend Ashford stood near the altar, conferring with his wife. He looked up as they approached, his face transitioning through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, disapproval, and finally, reluctant acceptance. Mrs. Morn, he said slowly, I see you've found someone to stand with you. Yes, Alara said, lifting her chin. This is Rowan Blake. He's agreed to act as Thomas's guardian for the baptism. Rowan Blake. The Reverend's tone made it clear he knew exactly who Rowan was, and wasn't certain this was an improvement over Alara standing alone. I wasn't aware you two were acquainted. We are, Rowan said before Alara could answer. His voice carried through the church, steady and sure. And I'm here to stand for the boy. A hush had fallen over the congregation. Every person in those pews had turned to stare at the unlikely pair standing at the back of the church, the desperate widow and the mountain hermit with a baby between them. Reverend Ashford's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then, perhaps recognizing that he'd been outmaneuvered, or perhaps simply exhausted by the drama, he sighed. Very well. Please take your places with the other baptism families. The pews near the front had spaces reserved for the families participating in the ceremony. Alara had seen them earlier, marked with small white ribbons. Now, she and Rowan walked down the center aisle toward those seats, and the crowd's whispers rose like a wave around them. Is that the lumberjack? I didn't know she knew him. How long has this been going on? The scandal of it. Henry barely cold in his grave. Maybe that's why she moved to the cabin, so they could... Hush, not in church. Alara kept her eyes forward, her back straight, refusing to let them see how their words landed. Beside her, Rowan walked with the same steady pace he'd maintained from the beginning, Thomas still cradled in his arms, apparently unbothered by the attention. They reached the front pew, the one Mrs. Ashford had told her was reserved, and sat down. The Hawthorns, already seated there with their twin girls, shifted uncomfortably, but didn't ask them to move. The organ music swelled, signaling the start of the ceremony, and gradually the whispers died down. Reverend Ashford took his place at the altar, his wife beside him with the baptismal basin. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of ritual. "We are gathered here today to welcome these children into the family of Christ, to wash away original sin and to dedicate them to a life of faith and service." The words washed over Alara, familiar from 100 services she'd attended. Beside her, she was achingly aware of Rowan's presence, the solid warmth of him, the way he held Thomas with such careful attention, the occasional small adjustments he made to keep the baby comfortable. Thomas, for his part, seemed utterly content. He didn't fuss or cry as the ceremony progressed. He simply rested in Rowan's arms, occasionally looking up at this new face with curious eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch. When the Reverend called for the baptism families to come forward, Alara and Rowan rose together. They approached the altar, and Alara was acutely conscious of the weight of every gaze in that church, the speculation and judgment pressing against her skin. "Who presents this child for baptism?" Reverend Ashford intoned. "I do," Alara said, her voice clear. "His mother." "And who stands as guardian and spiritual guide?" There was a pause, a heartbeat where Alara's courage almost failed, where she thought Rowan might change his mind, might step back and leave her exposed once more. Then Rowan's voice, deep and steady. "I do." The Reverend's hands moved through the familiar motions, touching the water, making the sign of the cross, anointing Thomas's forehead. "I baptize you, Thomas Henry Morn, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. May you grow in grace and wisdom, protected and guided by your family, and may God's blessing remain upon you all your days." It was done. Thomas was baptized, blessed, welcomed into the church community. And standing beside Alara, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder in a gesture that looked natural and protective, Rowan Blake had given her son what she couldn't provide alone: legitimacy. They returned to their pew as the other families came forward. Alara should have been relieved, triumphant even. She'd achieved what she came for. Thomas was blessed, and after today she'd never have to impose on Rowan Blake again. But as she sat in that pew, watching him rock her son gently when Thomas began to fuss, watching the careful way he supported the baby's head, the unexpected tenderness in those rough hands, she felt something shift inside her chest. Gratitude, yes, but also something more complicated, something that made her throat tight and her eyes sting with tears she couldn't shed, not here, not in front of everyone. This stranger had given her more than just his presence. He'd given her dignity. He'd stood beside her when no one else would, and he'd asked for nothing in return. The ceremony ended, and the congregation began to file out for the reception on the church lawn. Alara and Rowan remained seated, letting the others leave first, avoiding the inevitable barrage of questions and false congratulations. When the church had mostly emptied, Rowan finally spoke. "You'll want him back now, I expect." It took Alara a moment to realize he meant Thomas. "Oh, yes, yes, of course." But when Rowan moved to transfer the baby back to her arms, Thomas made a small sound of protest, his hand fisting in Rowan's shirt. He didn't want to let go. "Sorry," Alara murmured, gently prying her son's fingers loose. "He's usually not like this with strangers." "He's a good boy," Rowan said quietly, and there was that flicker of pain again, gone almost before it appeared. "You've done well with him. On your own." The compliment, simple and sincere, hit Alara harder than any of the day's cruelties. Her vision blurred with tears, and she had to look away, focusing on settling Thomas against her shoulder. "Thank you," she managed. "For today. For what you did. I know it was an imposition, and I'm sorry I put you in that position, but I didn't know what else—" "Mrs. Morn." Rowan stood, and she had to crane her neck to look up at him. "You don't need to apologize. I'm glad I could help. Still, if there's ever anything I can do to repay you—" "There's not." He said it firmly, but not unkindly. "No debt, no obligation. You needed help, and I gave it. That's all." He turned to leave, and panic flared in Alara's chest. She wasn't sure why. The arrangement was over just as she'd promised. He'd done what she asked, and now he was free to return to his mountain, to his solitary life. But the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Mr. Blake, wait." He paused, looking back. "Will you—" Alara hesitated, unsure what she was even asking. "Will you walk us home? It's a long way through the forest, and after today I don't think I can face the reception, all those questions and stares. I just want to go home." For a long moment, Rowan said nothing. Then, "All right, get your things." It was only after they'd left the church, after they'd walked past the reception tables laden with cakes and lemonade, past the clusters of gossiping women, past the children playing in the spring grass, that Alara realized what she'd done. She'd extended this pretense beyond the church. She'd asked him to walk her home, through the forest, where anyone might see them, where the gossip would grow and spread like wildflower. And Rowan Blake, that strange, solitary man, had said yes without hesitation. As they entered the cool shade of the forest path, Thomas drowsing against her shoulder and Rowan walking silent and steady beside her, Alara wondered what kind of bargain she'd really made in the shadows of that church, and whether she'd just saved her son's future or irrevocably complicated her own. The forest path wound through stands of pine and oak, their new leaves casting dappled shadows across the worn dirt trail. Alara had walked this route countless times since moving to the cabin after Henry's death, sometimes with purpose, heading to town for supplies, sometimes simply to escape the emptiness of the house. She knew every route that jutted across the path, every place where the trail narrowed or widened, every birdsong that marked the changing seasons. But today, with Rowan Blake walking beside her in silence, the familiar journey felt entirely different. He moved with the easy stride of someone accustomed to rough terrain, his boots making almost no sound on the packed earth. Every few minutes, his gaze would sweep the surrounding trees, noting things she couldn't see, a snapped branch here, disturbed undergrowth there. The habits of a man who lived alone in the wilderness, always alert, always reading the forest like other men read newspapers. Thomas had fallen completely asleep against Alara's shoulder, his small body warm and heavy with the deep sleep of infancy. She adjusted her grip, trying to ease the ache in her arms without waking him. "I can carry him if you'd like," Rowan offered, the first words either of them had spoken since leaving the church grounds. "No, thank you. I've got him." Alara's response came automatically, that fierce protectiveness rising up again. Then, hearing how sharp her voice sounded, she added more gently, "He's fine. Almost home anyway." Almost home. Another 20 minutes of walking, maybe less, and then this strange interlude would end. Rowan would return to his mountain, and she'd return to her solitary life with Thomas, and today would become just another story the valley women whispered about over their washing and their quilting. Poor Alara Morn. So desperate she had to ask the hermit Lumberjack to pretend. Can you imagine? "They'll talk," Alara said abruptly, the thought escaping before she could contain it. "About today. About us." I'm sorry for that. Rowan's stride didn't falter. Already said, doesn't matter what they talk about. It matters if it affects your business. If people think that you and I are, that we're, she couldn't quite bring herself to finish the sentence. That we're what? Courting? Involved? He said the words plainly, without embarrassment. Let them think it. Won't change whether they buy my timber or not. They need lumber. I cut lumber. That's all the relationship that matters. His pragmatism should have been reassuring, but instead it made Alara feel strangely hollow. Of course he was right. Of course the valley needed his timber regardless of his personal life. But she couldn't help feeling that she dragged him into something messy and complicated, something that might cost him more than he realized. Still, she persisted, your reputation, Mrs. Morn. He stopped walking, and she stopped too, turning to face him. His blue eyes were serious but not unkind. I have no reputation to protect. I'm the strange man who lives on the mountain and talks to no one. That's what they say about me, and it's true enough. Adding a rumor about helping a widow won't change anything that matters. It matters to me, Alara said quietly. What you did today, standing with me when no one else would, it matters to me. Something shifted in Rowan's expression, a crack in that careful blankness. For just a moment she saw something raw underneath, loneliness maybe, or recognition, the look of someone who understood exactly what it meant to stand alone. Then it was gone, and he was turning back to the path, resuming his steady pace. Your cabin's just ahead, isn't it? Through that clearing? Alara blinked at the abrupt change of subject, but followed his lead. Yes, just past the old oak. They walked the remaining distance in renewed silence, emerging from the forest into the small clearing where her cabin stood. It was a humble structure, one room with a loft, really, built by Henry's father 40 years ago. The logs were weathered but solid, and the roof was tight thanks to repairs Henry had made the autumn before he died. There was a small vegetable garden plot, empty now except for a few winter-hardy herbs, and a chicken coop that housed her 4 hens. Smoke curled from the chimney. Alara frowned, confused, before remembering. She'd banked the fire before leaving that morning, but hadn't let it die completely. It must have revived itself in the hours she'd been gone. It's not much, she said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the humble dwelling. But it's home. Rowan's gaze swept across the clearing, taking in the cabin, the garden, the small woodshed beside the coop. His eyes lingered on something near the porch, and his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Your porch step is cracked, he said. 3rd one from the top. You'll want to fix that before someone puts their foot through and breaks an ankle. Alara looked where he was pointing and saw what she'd been ignoring for weeks, a split in the wood that had been growing steadily worse with each freeze and thaw. She'd meant to repair it, but between caring for Thomas and managing the garden and the chickens and everything else, there never seemed to be time. I know, she admitted. It's on my list, along with about 100 other things that need fixing. Your list might be shorter with 2 people working on it. The suggestion hung in the air between them, unexpected and loaded with implications Alara wasn't sure how to interpret. Was he offering to help, or simply making an observation about the general difficulties of maintaining a homestead alone? Before she could formulate a response, Thomas stirred against her shoulder, making small grumbling sounds that meant he'd wake fully in moments, and once awake, he'd be hungry and fussy. I should get him inside, Alara said. Fed and changed. Thank you again, Mr. Blake, for everything today. I truly don't know what I would have done without... Your woodpile is low. Alara followed his gaze to the covered stack beside the cabin. He was right. She had perhaps 2 weeks' worth of split wood remaining, and after that she'd need to cut more. Another task on that endless list. I'll manage, she said, more defensively than she'd intended. I've been managing for 14 months. I know you have. There was no condescension in his voice, only a simple statement of fact. But managing and thriving aren't the same thing, and there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered. Is it? Offered, I mean? Alara searched his face, trying to understand what he was really saying. Because if you're offering out of some sense of obligation, some feeling that because you stood with me today, you now have to... I don't do things out of obligation, Rowan interrupted, his voice still even but with an edge of something firmer underneath. I offered because your woodpile is low, and I know how to split wood, that's all, not complicated. Thomas began to cry in earnest now, his small face scrunching up with indignation at being hungry and uncomfortable. Alara bounced him gently, but she knew from experience that once he reached this point, only milk and a clean diaper would satisfy him. I really need to get him inside, she said apologetically. But thank you for the offer. I'll think about it. She turned toward the cabin, fumbling with the latch while supporting Thomas's weight. Behind her, she heard Rowan's footsteps, not walking away down the path as she'd expected, but moving toward the woodshed. Mr. Blake, what are you... But he'd already reached the shed and was examining the axe she kept there, testing its edge with his thumb, his expression disapproving. This hasn't been sharpened in weeks. Dangerous to use a dull blade. More likely to glance off and hit your leg than split the wood clean. I know that, Alara said, exasperation bleeding into her voice despite her gratitude. I just haven't had time to sharpen it properly. Thomas's cries escalated to proper wailing, and Alara gave up on the conversation, pushing through the cabin door and into the dim interior. She'd deal with the strange, helpful lumberjack after she'd dealt with her furious son. The cabin was exactly as she'd left it, neat because she couldn't stand disorder, spare because she owned so little. The main room held a table and 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and a cradle that Henry had made before Thomas was born. In the corner stood her small bed, and above, the loft where Thomas would sleep when he was older held only boxes and memories she couldn't bear to sort through yet. Alara settled in the rocking chair and began nursing Thomas, who latched on immediately and stopped crying as suddenly as if someone had turned off a spigot. The familiar rhythm of it, the gentle pull, the small sounds of satisfaction, the weight of him in her arms, began to ease the tension that had coiled through her all day. Through the window, she could see Rowan moving around the woodshed. He'd found her whetstone, apparently, because she could hear the distinctive sound of metal sliding against stone, regular and practiced. He was sharpening her axe. She should tell him to stop, should insist that she could handle her own tools, her own work. But Thomas was feeding, and she was tired, so tired, and the sound of someone else taking care of something, anything, was strangely comforting. By the time Thomas had finished nursing and been changed and settled in his cradle for a nap, the sharpening sounds had stopped. Alara peered through the window and saw no sign of Rowan. He must have left while she was distracted with the baby. Good. That was good. He'd done his kindness and gone home just as they'd implicitly agreed. But when she opened the door to check on the chickens before starting her own belated lunch, she nearly collided with Rowan on the porch. He was crouched down, examining the cracked step with a focus that suggested he'd been there for several minutes. You didn't leave, Alara said stupidly. Hadn't finished yet. He ran his hand along the crack, testing the wood's integrity. This whole step needs to be replaced. The wood's rotted through underneath. Patching the crack won't fix the problem. Mr. Blake, I've got spare lumber at my place. Good, seasoned oak. I could bring a piece down tomorrow, replace this properly. Take maybe an hour. Tomorrow? Alara's voice came out higher than intended. You're planning to come back tomorrow? Rowan looked up at her, those blue eyes steady and guileless. Unless you'd rather I didn't. It's not that, it's just... She struggled to find words that wouldn't sound ungrateful or, worse, frightened. Though perhaps she was frightened, just a little. Not of him. She didn't fear Rowan Blake would hurt her. But of what it might mean if he kept coming back, kept helping, kept being present in her life and Thomas's. Of what the valley would say. Of what she herself might start to want. Just what? He prompted when she'd been silent too long. It's just that I don't want you to feel obligated. You've already done so much today, and I release you from any sense of duty that you might... Mrs. Morn. He stood, and she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I'm not a man who does things out of duty. When I stood with you today, that was my choice. If I come tomorrow to fix your step, that'll be my choice too. And if you'd rather I didn't, you only have to say so, and I'll respect that. But don't make up reasons for me. Don't decide what I should or shouldn't feel obligated about. That's for me to figure out. His directness was startling. Most people in the valley wrapped their meanings in layers of implication and social nicety, saying one thing and meaning another. Rowan Blake apparently had no patience for that kind of dancing around. Alara found it both refreshing and unsettling. "All right," she said slowly. "Then I'll be direct too. Why are you doing this? Really, you don't know me. You don't owe me anything. So why offer to come back and fix my porch? Why stay and sharpen my axe when you could have left an hour ago?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past her to the forest beyond, to the mountains where he made his home. When he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "Because I know what it's like," he said simply. "To be alone. To have no one offer help because you're too proud to ask for it, or because they assume you don't need it, or because they just don't see you at all anymore. And I know that sometimes the loneliest thing in the world is managing, just barely managing, every day, and having everyone congratulate you for being so strong when you feel like you're drowning." The words hit Alara like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Because he was right. That was exactly how she felt, like she was drowning slowly, in full view of everyone, and they all just smiled and told her how well she was coping. "How did you—" she started, then stopped. "I mean, you seem so solitary by choice." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I am now, but I wasn't always. Once I had—" He trailed off, and that flicker of old pain crossed his face again. "Well, that's a story for another time. Point is, I recognize the signs. And I thought maybe you could use some help, that's all." Alara's throat felt tight. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything, just tell me. Do you want me to fix the step tomorrow or not?" She should say no, should thank him politely and send him away and return to her isolated, independent existence. It was safer that way, simpler, less likely to result in heartbreak or disappointment or the valley's censure. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, "Yes. Yes, I'd like that, thank you." Rowan nodded, satisfied. "I'll come by mid-morning, after my first timber run, but before the day gets too hot." He moved past her, down the porch steps, carefully avoiding the cracked one, and toward the forest path. "Mr. Blake?" Alara called after him. He paused, looking back. Will you at least stay for coffee before you go? It's the least I can offer after everything today." He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he'd refuse. Then, "All right, coffee would be good." They sat at her small table, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, drinking coffee that was probably too strong, but that Rowan didn't complain about. Thomas slept in his cradle, making small snuffling sounds occasionally. The fire crackled in the hearth. It was, Alara realized, the first time she'd shared a meal, even something as simple as coffee, with another adult since Henry died. Mrs. Chen had come by a few times in those first weeks, bringing soup and casseroles and well-meaning advice. But she'd never stayed long, never sat down like this, comfortable in the silence. Rowan Blake seemed perfectly content not to fill the quiet with chatter. He drank his coffee, his gaze occasionally drifting to the cradle where Thomas slept, and waited. Finally, Alara broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "Fair enough." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, gathering courage. "Why did you come to the baptism today? To the church, I mean. You don't strike me as particularly religious, and everyone says you never come to services." "I don't," he confirmed. "Usually. So why today?" Rowan was quiet for so long that Alara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "My son would have been baptized in the spring, if he'd lived." The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, rippling outward with implications that made Alara's chest ache. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." "No one knows. It was a long time ago. Before I came here." He stared down into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking. He and his mother, fever took them both. Same year, different seasons. She went first in the winter. He followed in spring, 3 days before his baptism date. "Oh, God. Rowan, I'm so—" "Don't." He looked up, and his eyes were dry but haunted. "Don't say you're sorry. I've heard sorry 1,000 times, and it doesn't change anything. I go to the church once a year on what would have been his baptism day. I stand in back, and I watch the families, and I remember, that's all. Tradition, maybe. Or penance. I'm not sure which anymore. Alara's throat burned with unshed tears. And today I dragged you into the middle of it, made you pretend to be... You didn't drag me anywhere. I made a choice. His voice was firm again, that momentary vulnerability shuddering away. And for what it's worth, holding your boy, standing with you, it didn't feel like pretending. Felt more real than most things have in a long time. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Alara didn't know how to respond, what to say that wouldn't sound trite or presumptuous. So instead she did something entirely impulsive. She reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, scarred from years of hard work. But they were warm, and when her hand touched his, they curled gently around hers, holding without grasping. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me, for trusting me with that." "Not many people I'd tell," Rowan admitted. "But seemed like you'd understand. Losing someone. Trying to build a life after." "I do understand." Alara squeezed his hand once, then released it, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of the gesture. "It's been 14 months, and some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like Henry's been gone forever. I can't remember his voice anymore. Isn't that terrible? I can see his face, but I can't hear his voice. That's not terrible. That's grief. It takes what it wants." They sat in silence again, but it was different now, weighted with shared understanding, with the recognition that they were both survivors of losses that had reshaped them fundamentally. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade toward evening. Rowan drained the last of his coffee and stood. "I should go, long walk back, and I've got timber to prep for tomorrow's run." "Of course." Alara walked him to the door, then followed him out onto the porch. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of pine and new growth. "Thank you again for everything." "I'll see you tomorrow," Rowan said, and it sounded like a promise. Alara watched him walk across the clearing and disappear into the forest, his tall form gradually swallowed by the shadows between the trees. Only when he was completely out of sight did she return inside, closing the door and leaning against it, her heart beating strangely fast. What had she done? What door had she opened by asking him into her life, even in such a small way? Thomas stirred in his cradle, making his waking up sounds. Alara went to him, lifting him into her arms, and his small hand immediately found her hair, tugging gently. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Did Mama make a wise choice today, or a foolish one?" Thomas, being 8 months old, offered no opinion, but he smiled at her, that toothless, trusting smile that meant she was his whole world. And really, that was all that mattered. She'd done what she had to do to get him baptized, to give him a place in the community. If there were consequences to that choice, she'd face them as they came. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Alara rose early, as always, to tend the chickens and prepare Thomas's breakfast. She told herself she wasn't watching the forest path for signs of Rowan's arrival, told herself she was simply going about her normal routine, and if he happened to show up to fix the porch step as promised, well, that would be helpful but not necessary. She was a terrible liar, even to herself. By mid-morning, she'd changed her dress twice, tidied the cabin until it gleamed, and baked bread. She didn't need to bake. Thomas watched these preparations from his cradle with wide, knowing eyes, as if he understood perfectly well what his mother was doing and found it amusing. "Don't look at me like that," Alara told him. "I'm simply being a good hostess, that's all." Thomas gurgled skeptically. When the knock finally came at the door, Alara nearly jumped out of her skin. She smoothed her dress, checked her hair in the small mirror by the wash basin, then forced herself to walk calmly to the door. Rowan stood on the porch, a length of oak planking balanced on one shoulder, a tool belt slung around his waist. He looked exactly as he had yesterday, work-worn and practical and utterly unbothered by social convention. "Morning," he said. "Ready to fix that step?" "Good morning. Yes, of course. Can I help with anything?" "You can keep clear of the work area so I don't accidentally drop lumber on your feet." He said it without a trace of humor, and it took Alara a moment to realize he was being protective, not dismissive. "I'll stay inside then, but call if you need anything." She retreated to the cabin, positioning herself where she could watch through the window while pretending to be occupied with darning Thomas's tiny socks. In reality, she couldn't focus on the mending at all. Her attention kept drifting to the man on her porch, efficiently prying up the damaged step, examining the structure underneath, making small adjustments with the confidence of someone who'd built things all his life. He worked steadily for perhaps 45 minutes, and when he finally stood and tested his weight on the new step, it held solid and true. He gathered his tools, and Alara expected him to call through the door that he was finished and leaving. Instead, he knocked again. "It's done," he said when she opened the door. "Should hold for years now, long as you keep it dry." "Thank you. It looks wonderful. Please, let me pay you for the lumber and your time." "No payment." He said it flatly, brooking no argument. "But I did notice something while I was working. Your rain barrel's got a crack in it. Come winter, it'll split completely. And your chicken coop could use a patch on the north side where the wind's getting through." Alara felt a complicated mix of gratitude and exasperation. "Mr. Blake, I can't keep accepting your charity." "Not charity. Maintenance. Things need fixing. I know how to fix them. Simple as that." He paused, studying her face. "But if it bothers you, keeping accounts, maybe we could trade. I fix things around here, I don't know. What are you good at?" "I can cook," Alara said. "And sew. I used to do mending for some of the families in town before Thomas was born." "My shirts could use mending," Rowan admitted. "And I'm a terrible cook. Live mostly on jerky and beans and whatever game I can shoot. A proper meal now and then would be welcome." It was a neat solution, Alara had to admit. A trait of skills that let her maintain her pride while accepting help she desperately needed. And yet something about the arrangement felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "All right," she heard herself say. "A trade. You fix things, I'll cook and mend." That's fair," Rowan nodded, satisfied. "I'll come back in a few days then. Fix that rain barrel and patch the coop. Maybe take a look at your roof while I'm at it. Notice some loose shingles." "A few days," Alara repeated, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. "Yes, all right." He tipped his head in farewell and turned to leave, but halfway across the clearing he paused and looked back. "Your boy," he called. "He doing all right? Settling after yesterday?" The question surprised her. Most people asked about babies as a formality, not because they genuinely wanted to know, but Rowan's expression suggested real interest. "He's well. Better than well, actually. Slept through the night for the first time in weeks. I think having the baptism done settled something in him. Or in me. Hard to say which." "Good." Rowan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That's good." Then he was gone again, disappearing into the forest with that same easy stride. Alara stood on her newly repaired porch step, testing its solid strength under her weight, and tried to convince herself that she hadn't just agreed to something much more complicated than trading meals for repairs. True to his word, Rowan returned 3 days later, and then again the following week. Each visit brought some new repair. The rain barrel patched, the chicken coop secured, loose shingles replaced, the garden fence strengthened against rabbits. Each visit ended with him accepting whatever meal she'd prepared, eating efficiently while making occasional comments about the food that might have been compliments, though they were stated as simple observations. "This stew is better than anything I've had in years." "Your bread's got a good crust." "Never had chicken cooked this way. It's good." And each time before he left, he'd check on Thomas. Not in the perfunctory way of someone fulfilling a social obligation, but with genuine attention. He'd crouch beside the cradle and talk to the baby in that low, rough voice, telling him about the trees he'd cut that week, the deer he'd seen on the mountain, the weather patterns he'd observed. Thomas, for his part, seemed utterly enchanted. He'd track Rowan's movements with his eyes, reach for him when he came close, fuss when he prepared to leave. "He's attached to you," Alara observed one afternoon, watching her son grab desperately for Rowan's finger. "I've never seen him take to anyone like this." "Babies know who's safe," Rowan said, letting Thomas grip his finger with surprising strength. "They've got good instincts." "Do you want to hold him while I finish preparing dinner?" It had become a routine. Rowan holding Thomas while Alara cooked, the baby content in those strong arms, occasionally babbling nonsense that Rowan would respond to as if it were serious conversation. "You think so?" Rowan would say gravely in response to Thomas's ba-ba-ba-da. "That's an interesting point. I'll have to consider that." Watching them together, Alara felt something unfurl in her chest, something warm and frightening and entirely inappropriate. She tried to tamp it down, to remind herself that this was a business arrangement, a trade of services, nothing more. But it was becoming harder to maintain that fiction with each passing week. The valley noticed, of course. How could they not? The hermit lumberjack was seen regularly on the path to the widow's cabin. He was spotted carrying lumber, tools, once even a small rocking horse he'd carved. The gossip grew from whispers to open speculation. Mrs. Sullivan stopped Alara in town one day, her expression carefully neutral. "I see Mr. Blake has been helping around your place." "He's made some repairs," Alara confirmed, her voice carefully level. "In exchange for meals. It's a fair trade." "I'm sure it is, dear, I'm sure it is." But Mrs. Sullivan's tone suggested she thought it was anything but. Alara held her head high and continued her shopping, refusing to justify herself further. Let them talk. Let them speculate. She was doing nothing wrong, just surviving, just accepting help offered freely. But that night, lying in bed and listening to Thomas's soft breathing from the cradle, she couldn't deny the truth. Rowan Blake had become part of her life in ways that went far beyond simple repairs and traded meals. She looked forward to his visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the work he'd do and everything to do with his presence, his steady calm, his dry humor, his unexpected gentleness with Thomas. She'd begun to notice details, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar when it needed cutting, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hands moved with such precise confidence, whether he was wielding an axe or cradling a baby. She'd begun, God help her, to care. And judging by the way Rowan had started staying longer each visit, by the way he'd sometimes pause at the door as if reluctant to leave, by the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, she suspected he might be starting to care too. It was dangerous. It was foolish. They were both carrying losses that hadn't healed, building something fragile on ground that might not hold. But as spring deepened into early summer, as her garden began to flourish, and Thomas learned to sit up on his own, and Rowan became as familiar a fixture around her cabin as the mountains themselves, Alara couldn't bring herself to step back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The realization that she was falling for Rowan Blake hit Alara on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, while she was hanging laundry and he was replacing the rotten boards on her woodshed roof. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no sudden revelation, no lightning strike of understanding, just the simple observation that she was happy, genuinely, deeply happy, for the first time since Henry died. And that happiness was directly tied to the sound of hammering above her head, to knowing that in an hour Rowan would climb down and she'd feed him lunch, and he'd hold Thomas while she cleaned up, and they'd talk about nothing important in that comfortable way they'd developed. The recognition terrified her. She was still pinning one of Thomas's tiny shirts to the line when she heard the hammering stop. A moment later, Rowan's boots hit the ground with a solid thump. "All done," he called. "Should be good for another 10 years at least." Alara turned, shielding her eyes against the sun to look at him. He was wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, his shirt clinging to his shoulders in the summer heat. There was sawdust in his hair and a satisfied expression on his face, the look of a man who'd done good work and knew it. "Thank you," she said, and heard the catch in her own voice. Rowan's expression shifted, concern replacing satisfaction. "You all right?" Yes, I'm fine, just..." She gestured vaguely at the laundry, the cabin, everything. "Grateful, I suppose, for all of this. For you." He studied her for a long moment, those blue eyes seeing more than she wanted them to. Then he crossed the clearing to where she stood, stopping just close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "Alara," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name instead of the formal Mrs. Morn. The sound of it in his rough voice did something to her composure. "You don't have to keep thanking me. I'm not doing this out of obligation or charity. I'm doing it because I want to be here." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Why do you want to be here? We're nothing to you. You're not nothing. He said it with such quiet intensity that her breath caught. You and Thomas, you're not nothing to me. Haven't been for a while now. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Alara wasn't sure either of them was ready to name. She could smell the honest sweat on him, the sawdust and pine sap that clung to his clothes, could see the pulse beating at the base of his throat. One step. That's all it would take. One step forward, and she could... Thomas's cry from inside the cabin shattered the moment. Not his hungry cry or his tired cry, but something sharper, more distressed. Both of them moved at once, Rowan reaching the door a stride ahead of her. The baby was in his cradle, his face flushed bright red, his small body rigid with discomfort. Alara scooped him up immediately, pressing her hand to his forehead. He's burning up, she said, fear spiking through her. Rowan, he's burning up. How long has he been sleeping? Rowan was already moving, dampening a cloth at her wash basin. 2 hours, maybe 3. He seemed fine when I put him down. Just a little fussy, but I thought... Her voice cracked. Oh, God, I should have checked on him sooner. I should have noticed. Hey! Rowan pressed the cool cloth into her hands. Don't do that. Don't blame yourself. Babies get fevers. It happens. But Alara could barely hear him over the roaring in her ears. Thomas was burning up, his little body radiating heat that couldn't be normal, couldn't be safe. And she knew, with the terrible certainty of someone who'd already lost too much, that this was how it started. This was how Henry's illness had begun. A fever, just a fever, until suddenly it wasn't. We need to get him to Mrs. Chen, she said, already moving toward the door. The midwife. She'll know what to do. Mrs. Chen lives on the other side of the valley. That's a 2-hour walk. Rowan's voice was calm but firm. There's a doctor in town. Closer. The town doctor won't see me. Alara's laugh came out bitter and broken. Not after I caused that scene at the church. Not without a man to vouch for me. You know how it is. Then I'll vouch for you. Rowan took the cloth from her shaking hands and gently wiped Thomas's face, trying to cool him. We'll go together, right now. Thomas let out a thin, reedy cry that sounded nothing like his usual robust complaints. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, and when Alara tried to get him to nurse, he turned his head away weakly. Something's wrong, she whispered. Something's really wrong. Rowan placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and grounding. Then we go. Now. Can you walk and carry him? Yes. Yes, I can. Good. I'll carry supplies. He was already moving, gathering a clean cloth, the water flask, a blanket to shield Thomas from the sun. His movements were quick and efficient, no wasted motion, no panic. Which way to the doctor? Through town, Main Street, blue house with white shutters. But Rowan, if he won't see us, he'll see us. There was something hard in Rowan's voice now, something that suggested anyone who tried to turn them away would regret it. Come on. They set off at a pace just shy of running, Alara clutching Thomas to her chest, while Rowan kept close beside her, ready to steady her if she stumbled. The path through the forest seemed endless, every root and rock a potential disaster. Thomas had gone frighteningly quiet, his small breaths coming fast and shallow. Talk to me, Rowan said as they walked. Keep talking. Tell me about when he was born. Was it an easy birth? Alara understood what he was doing, keeping her focused, keeping her from spiraling into panic. She forced words through her tight throat. Long. It was long. Nearly 20 hours. Mrs. Chen said he was stubborn even then, taking his time. Takes after his mother, then. Despite everything, Alara almost smiled. Henry said the same thing. He waited with me the whole time, right outside the bedroom. Mrs. Chen finally had to tell him to go chop wood or something useful because his pacing was making her nervous. Sounds like a good man. He was. Alara pressed her lips to Thomas's hot forehead. He would have loved him so much. Would have been such a good father. He is being a good father, Rowan said quietly. Through you. Everything you're doing for Thomas. That's Henry, too. That's his love working through you. The words cracked something open in Alara's chest, and tears burned behind her eyes. But there was no time for crying, no time for grief. Thomas needed her strong right now. They emerged from the forest path onto the road that led to town. Even from a distance, Alara could see people on the main street going about their daily business. Her stomach clenched. By tonight, everyone would know she'd come running to town with the lumberjack. The gossip would reach new heights. Let them talk, she thought fiercely. Let them say whatever they want. My son needs help. The doctor's house stood on a quiet street just off the main square. Dr. Morrison was a stern man in his 60s, respected in the valley for his skill, but known for his rigid adherence to propriety. Alara had never had reason to visit him before. Mrs. Chen had attended Thomas's birth, as she attended most births in the valley. Rowan reached the door first and knocked sharply. When no immediate answer came, he knocked again, louder. The door opened to reveal Dr. Morrison himself, his gray hair neatly combed, his expression already pinching with disapproval at the urgency of the summons. Yes? What's the meaning of— He stopped when he saw Alara, recognition flashing across his face. Then his gaze moved to Rowan, and his disapproval deepened. I see. My son needs help, Alara said, her voice shaking but clear. He has a high fever. He won't eat. Please, Dr. Morrison, please look at him. The doctor's expression didn't soften. Mrs. Morn, I'm afraid my schedule is quite full today. Perhaps Mrs. Chen is 2 hours away, Rowan interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. This child needs a doctor now, not in 2 hours, now. Mr. Blake, I presume. Dr. Morrison's tone was icy. I've heard about your arrangement with Mrs. Morn. However, that doesn't give you the right to make demands on my time. There are protocols, proper ways of requesting medical attention. To hell with protocols. Rowan moved closer, and though he didn't touch the doctor, his size alone was intimidating. There's a sick baby who needs help. That's the only thing that matters. Now, are you going to do your job, or do I need to carry this child to the next town and find a doctor who actually cares about saving lives? Dr. Morrison's face flushed red. How dare you! Thomas chose that moment to make a sound that barely qualified as a cry, more of a thin, desperate wheeze. It was the sound of a child too sick to protest properly, and it cut through all the posturing and propriety like a knife. The doctor's expression shifted. Whatever his opinions about Ilara's reputation or Rowan's presumption, he was still a medical man at heart. He stepped back from the door. Bring him in, quickly. The examination room was clean and spare, smelling of carbolic and dried herbs. Doctor. Morrison directed Alara to lay Thomas on the examination table, then bent over him with practiced efficiency, checking his temperature, his breathing, listening to his chest, examining his throat. Alara stood to the side, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Rowan was beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, his presence solid and steadying. How long has he had the fever? Dr. Morrison asked, all business now. I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 hours. He seemed fine this morning, just a little fussy. Any other symptoms? Rash? Vomiting? No, nothing, just the fever, and now he won't nurse. The doctor continued his examination, his frown deepening. Finally, he straightened. It's croup. You can hear the inflammation in his breathing. It's relatively common in infants, especially during seasonal changes. The fever is concerning, but not immediately dangerous if we manage it properly. Relief crashed over Alara so hard she nearly collapsed. Rowan's hand found hers, squeezing gently. What do we do? She asked. How do we manage it? Cool baths to bring the fever down. Steam to help with the breathing. Boil water and let him breathe the vapor, but not too close or you'll scald him. And this? He moved to a cabinet and began measuring out a powder. Willow bark tea. 1/2 cup, 3 times a day. It'll help with the fever and the inflammation. He demonstrated how to prepare the tea, how to hold Thomas for the steam treatments, what danger signs to watch for. His manner was brusque but thorough, and Alara absorbed every instruction desperately. If the fever doesn't break by tomorrow evening, bring him back, Dr. Morrison said. And if his breathing becomes more labored, a rasping sound, or if he struggles to draw breath, come immediately. Don't wait. Thank you, Alara breathed. Thank you so much. What do I owe you? The doctor named a price that made Alara's stomach drop, She had some money saved, but this would take nearly all of it. Still, she'd pay 10 times that amount if it meant Thomas would be all right. She was fumbling with her purse when Rowan's voice cut through her thoughts. "I'll cover it." "No." Alara looked up sharply. "No, Rowan, you've done enough. I can pay us." "I know you can, but you'll need that money for supplies, for keeping your household running. Let me do this." He was already counting out coins, placing them on the doctor's desk. "Please." Dr. Morrison took the money, his expression unreadable. "The baby should recover fully in a few days. Keep him cool and comfortable. And Mrs. Morn," he paused, "whatever arrangements you've made in your personal life are your own business. But for what it's worth, you're fortunate to have someone willing to help you through this." It was as close to approval as they were likely to get. Alara nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and gathered Thomas back into her arms. The walk back to the cabin seemed even longer than the walk to town. Exhaustion dragged at Alara's limbs, and fear still clawed at her chest despite the doctor's reassurances. Croup could turn serious quickly. She'd heard stories of children who seemed fine one moment and were fighting for breath the next. "He'll be all right," Rowan said, as if reading her thoughts. "We caught it early. You got him help in time." "Because of you." Alara's voice was thick with emotion. "If you hadn't been there, if I'd had to walk to Mrs. Chen's alone, but I was there. So there's no point in thinking about what might have happened." His logic was sound, but it didn't stop the what-ifs from churning through her mind. By the time they reached the cabin, the summer afternoon had faded toward evening. The first thing Rowan did was build up the fire and set water to boil for the steam treatment. Then he helped Alara prepare the willow bark tea, measuring carefully according to Dr. Morrison's instructions. Thomas took the tea in tiny, reluctant sips, making faces at the bitter taste, but he kept it down, and after the steam treatment, his breathing did seem slightly easier. "I should draw a cool bath for him," Alara said. "Try to bring the fever down more." "You should rest," Rowan countered. "You're shaking. When did you last eat?" Alara tried to remember. Breakfast, maybe? Everything after that was a blur of fear and motion. "I'm fine. Thomas needs his mother to be strong enough to care for him." Rowan's voice was gentle but firm. "Which means you need to eat something. I'll watch him while you do." "I can't just..." "Alara." He took her shoulders, turning her to face him. "I'm not leaving. Not tonight. Not until we know he's through the worst of this. So you might as well let me help. Please." The offer should have been scandalous. An unmarried man staying overnight in a widow's cabin. The valley gossips would have a field day. But Alara found she didn't care. Didn't care about anything except the fact that Thomas was sick, and she was terrified, and Rowan was offering her the one thing she needed most, not to be alone. "All right," she whispered. "All right." She forced herself to eat some bread and cheese while Rowan held Thomas, walking slow circles around the cabin and humming tunelessly. It wasn't quite a lullaby, but Thomas seemed soothed by it, his small body relaxing slightly against Rowan's broad chest. They took turns through the evening, one holding Thomas while the other prepared the next round of tea or steam treatment, or simply rested. As night fell, Alara prepared a cool bath and gently lowered Thomas into it, watching anxiously as he whimpered at the temperature but didn't fight it. "That's good," Rowan said, his hand on her shoulder. "See? His color's already better." He was right. The frightening red flush was fading from Thomas's cheeks, and his eyes seemed clearer, more focused. After the bath, dressed in a clean nightgown, Thomas finally managed to nurse a little, taking enough milk that Alara's panic eased fractionally. "He's getting better," she said, more to convince herself than anything. "Isn't he? He's getting better?" "He is." Rowan's certainty was a lifeline she clung to. "The fever's breaking. You can see it." They settled in the rocking chair together, Alara holding Thomas, Rowan standing behind her with his hands on the chair's back, rocking it gently. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with shared purpose, shared fear, shared relief. Somewhere around midnight, Thomas's breathing finally evened out into the deep rhythm of genuine sleep. His fever, while not gone completely, had dropped to something less terrifying. And Alara, who'd been running on pure adrenaline for hours, felt the exhaustion crash over her all at once. Her eyes drifted closed despite her best efforts to stay alert. The rocking chair's motion was hypnotic, and Rowan's presence behind her was so solid, so safe. "Rest," she heard him murmur. "I've got you. Both of you. Rest." And because she was too tired to fight, too grateful to protest, Alara let herself drift. The last thing she was aware of was Rowan's hand coming to rest gently on her shoulder, keeping watch while she finally let go. She woke to early morning light streaming through the window and the realization that she was in her bed, still fully clothed, with Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside her. She had no memory of getting there, which meant Rowan must have carried her at some point in the night. Panicked, she checked Thomas immediately. His forehead was warm but not burning, his breathing was clear. And when she lifted him, he opened his eyes and looked at her with something like his usual awareness, then let out a small, cranky cry that was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. A normal, healthy baby cry. "Thank God," she breathed, pressing her lips to his forehead. "Oh, thank God." A sound from the main room drew her attention. She carried Thomas out to find Rowan asleep in the rocking chair, his long legs stretched out awkwardly, his head tilted back at an angle that would give him a terrible crick in his neck. He'd stayed, all night, keeping watch. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened. For a moment he looked disoriented, then he focused on her and Thomas, and relief washed visibly across his face. "His fever?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Better, much better. I think the worst has passed." Alara found she was smiling, actually smiling. "You were right. We caught it in time." Rowan stood, stretching with a wince. "Good, that's good." They looked at each other across the small cabin, and something hung in the air between them, something bigger than gratitude, deeper than friendship. Thomas squirmed in Alara's arms, making his hungry sounds, and the moment passed. "I should feed him," Alara said, "and you must be exhausted and sore from that chair. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep. You should have woken me. You needed rest." Rowan was already moving toward the door. "I should head home anyway, check on things, but I'll come back this afternoon, make sure he's still improving." "Rowan, wait." Alara shifted Thomas to one hip and crossed to where Rowan stood. This close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the worry that hadn't quite faded. "I don't know how to thank you. What you did yesterday, staying through the night. You don't have to thank me." But his voice was softer now, rougher. "When I heard him cry like that, when I saw how scared you were..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I couldn't leave. Couldn't even think of leaving." "Why?" Alara asked the question she'd been circling around for weeks. "Why do you care so much? About us? About Thomas? Why?" Rowan was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out, his calloused fingers gentle as they touched Thomas's small hand. The baby immediately grabbed his finger, holding tight. "Because," Rowan said slowly, "for 6 years I've been half alive, going through motions, existing but not living. And then you walked up to me in that church and asked me to pretend to be this boy's father. And for the first time since I lost my own son, I felt something besides grief and guilt and emptiness." His blue eyes met hers, and they were devastating in their honesty. "You and Thomas, you brought me back, made me remember what it feels like to care about something besides just getting through another day. So when you ask why I care, why I stayed, it's because you two gave me a reason to stay, gave me something worth protecting again." Alara's throat was too tight to speak. Thomas chose that moment to babble something. "Da-da-da!" reaching both hands toward Rowan now. They both froze. It was just baby babbling. Thomas had been making those sounds for weeks, random syllables that didn't mean anything, but this time the sounds were directed, intentional. He was reaching for Rowan and calling for him. "He doesn't mean," Alara started. "I know." But Rowan's voice had gone rough, and when he looked down at Thomas, there was something raw and broken and healing all at once in his expression. "I know he doesn't." But Thomas insisted. "Da-da-da," his little hands opening and closing, demanding. And slowly, carefully, Rowan reached out and took him from Alara's arms. The baby settled immediately, content against Rowan's chest, one small hand patting his jaw. "Da," Thomas said again, softer now, satisfied. And Rowan Blake, The lonely lumberjack who'd lost everything, who'd spent 6 years building walls around his heart, looked down at the child in his arms with tears gathering in his eyes. "Hey there, little one," he whispered. "You feeling better?" Thomas smiled up at him, that full, trusting baby smile. And something fundamental shifted in the small cabin, in the space between the three of them. This wasn't pretend anymore. Maybe it never had been. Alara watched them, this man and her son, this unexpected constellation of her life, and felt her heart make a choice her mind hadn't quite caught up to yet. Felt herself crossing a threshold she'd been approaching since that desperate moment in the church. "Rowan," she said quietly. He looked up, Thomas still cradled in his arms. "Don't go." The words came out barely above a whisper. "I mean, you should go home and rest, but then come back. Not just this afternoon. Come back and stay. For dinner, for the evening. I don't want—" And she took a breath, gathering courage. "I don't want to be alone anymore. And I don't think Thomas wants that either. Alara, I know it's improper. I know what people will say. But I stopped caring about that sometime last night when you were the only person in the world I trusted with my son's life. When you stayed up all night keeping watch so I could sleep. When you—" her voice cracked. "When you looked at him just now like he matters to you. Like we both matter to you." Rowan's throat worked, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, might step back and return to his mountain and his solitude, putting distance between them before things got any more complicated. Instead, he said, "You do matter to me, both of you, more than I probably should admit, more than I thought I'd ever care about anything again." "Then stay," Alara repeated. "Please." Thomas, apparently sensing the weight of the moment, made a small sound of agreement. Rowan's lips quirked, not quite a smile, but close. "All right," he said finally. "I'll go home, take care of what needs doing, but I'll be back by evening, and Alara—" He paused. "I want you to be sure about this, about what you're inviting, because once I start really being part of your lives, I don't know if I can step back again. I don't want you to step back." The certainty in her own voice surprised her. "I want you here. We want you here." Something in Rowan's expression eased, and for the first time since she'd met him, Alara saw him genuinely smile. Not that slight quirk of his lips, but an actual smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. "Then I'll be back," he promised. "Count on it." He handed Thomas back to her reluctantly, the baby protesting the transfer with a small whine. Then Rowan touched Alara's cheek, just a brief brush of his fingers, but it sent warmth cascading through her, and headed for the door. Alara stood on the porch with Thomas in her arms, watching Rowan walk across the clearing toward the forest path. Just before he reached the trees, he turned back and lifted his hand in farewell. She waved back, her heart hammering against her ribs with something that felt dangerously like hope. Whatever was happening between them, whatever they were becoming, it was real now, acknowledged. And though it terrified her, though she knew the valley would have opinions and there would be complications ahead, Alara couldn't bring herself to regret it. Thomas had called Rowan Da, and Rowan had looked at her son with love. The rest, she thought, they'd figure out together. True to his word, Rowan returned that evening just as the sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Alara heard his footsteps on the porch. She'd learned to recognize his particular rhythm, steady and unhurried, and felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. When she opened the door, he stood there with a bundle wrapped in cloth tucked under one arm and a somewhat sheepish expression on his face. "Brought something," he said by way of greeting. "Wasn't sure if you'd need it, but thought it might help." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal several pieces of carved wood, smooth, sanded pieces that fit together to form a small chair, perfectly sized for a toddler. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each joint fitted with precision, the wood polished to a warm sheen. "For Thomas," Rowan continued when Alara didn't immediately respond, "for when he's bigger, old enough to sit at table properly. I carved his name into the back, see?" He turned the chair, and there it was, Thomas, carved in simple, elegant letters across the top rail. Something about seeing her son's name rendered permanent in wood, shaped by Rowan's hands, made Alara's eyes sting with unexpected tears. It's beautiful, she managed. When did you, how did you have time to? Been working on it for a few weeks now. At night, mostly. Gives me something to do besides think. He set the chair down carefully just inside the door. Wasn't sure when I'd give it to him, but after last night, after he... Rowan's voice caught slightly. Seemed like the right time. Thomas, who'd been playing contentedly on a blanket near the hearth, caught sight of Rowan and immediately began his demanding da-da-da refrain, arms outstretched. Rowan crossed to him without hesitation, scooping him up and lifting him high enough to make the baby squeal with delight. "How's he doing?" Rowan asked, his attention focused on Thomas's face, checking for any signs of lingering illness. "Fever still down?" "Gone completely," Alara reported, moving to stir the pot of stew she'd been preparing. "He nursed well this afternoon and kept everything down. Dr. Morrison was right. We caught it early enough." "Good." Rowan settled into the rocking chair with Thomas, who immediately grabbed a fistful of his shirt and began babbling an incomprehensible story. "That's real good." They fell into an easy rhythm that evening, Alara cooking while Rowan entertained Thomas, then eating together at the small table while Thomas dozed in his cradle. The conversation flowed naturally, comfortably, touching on small things and larger ones. Rowan told her about the stand of oak he'd been surveying on the north face of the mountain, about a fox den he'd discovered, about his plans to expand his timber operation come fall. Alara shared stories about Thomas's development, how he was trying to pull himself up on furniture now, how he'd discovered his own toes and was fascinated by them, how he smiled every time he heard a bird sing. Normal things, domestic things, the kind of conversation married couples had over dinner, sharing the details of their separate days. The thought sent a flutter of something through Alara's chest, not quite fear, not quite excitement, something in between. "You're quiet," Rowan observed after they'd cleared the dishes. "Something on your mind?" Alara dried her hands on her apron, trying to organize thoughts that felt jumbled and complicated. "I was just thinking about how natural this feels. You being here, the three of us together, and that scares me a little." "Why does it scare you?" "Because nothing this good has lasted in my life." The admission came out more raw than she'd intended. "Henry and I had 2 years of marriage before the fever took him. 2 years. And I thought that was forever, that we'd have decades together. But we didn't. And now here you are. And Thomas loves you, and I—" She stopped, unable to quite finish the sentence. Rowan stood, crossing to where she stood by the wash basin. He didn't touch her, but his presence was solid and grounding. "And you what?" "I'm afraid," Alara whispered, "of caring too much, of letting you become necessary to us, and then losing you too. I don't think I could survive that again." "Alara," Rowan's voice was gentle but firm, "I can't promise you forever. Nobody can. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed for any of us. You learned that with Henry, and I learned it with Sarah and my boy. But I can promise you that I'm not going anywhere by choice, that as long as you'll have me, I'll be here." "The valley won't make it easy for us," she said. "You know that, don't you? They're already talking. And if you keep coming here, if we keep—" She gestured vaguely between them. "Whatever this is we're doing, it'll get worse." "Let them talk." Rowan's jaw set in that stubborn line she was beginning to recognize. "Their opinions don't keep me warm at night. Their gossip doesn't put food on my table. And their approval sure as hell doesn't make me happy. You and Thomas do that." The simple declaration hit Alara harder than any poetry could have. This man, who spoke so rarely and so plainly, had just laid his heart bare with a handful of words. "I care about you," she said, needing him to hear it spoken clearly. "More than I probably should after such a short time, more than is sensible or proper. But I do." Something shifted in Rowan's expression, relief and joy and vulnerability all at once. "I care about you too, both of you. Have for a while now." They stood there in the lamplight, the space between them charged with possibility. Alara could close that distance, could rise on her toes and kiss him and see where this careful dance they'd been doing might lead. But Thomas chose that moment to wake with a fussy cry, and the moment passed. Rowan stepped back, and Alara went to tend to her son, and they didn't speak of feelings again that night. But something had been acknowledged, Something had shifted from implicit to explicit. And when Rowan finally left near midnight, he paused at the door and said, "I'll be back tomorrow, and the day after that. As many days as you'll let me." "I'll let you," Alara said softly, "for as many days as we get." The pattern established itself quickly after that. Rowan came every day, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. He brought timber to repair the cabin's weaknesses, supplies from town, once even a rocking horse he'd carved that made Thomas shriek with delight. But mostly, he brought himself. His steady presence, his quiet competence, his unexpected gentleness with Thomas. He taught the baby to clap his hands together, to play peekaboo behind his large scarred fingers, to laugh at funny faces. And he helped Alara with everything, splitting wood, hauling water, repairing the endless small things that broke on a homestead. He worked alongside her in the garden, his large hands surprisingly deft with delicate seedlings. He sat with her in the evenings while she mended clothes, their comfortable silence broken only by Thomas's babbling or the crackle of the fire. It felt like building something, like laying a foundation, brick by careful brick. The valley noticed, of course. How could they not? The hermit lumberjack had essentially moved into the widow's life, and the scandal of it grew with each passing week. Mrs. Sullivan stopped speaking to Alara entirely. The Hawthorns crossed the street to avoid her in town. Even Mrs. Chen, who'd been kind after Henry's death, looked at her with disappointment now. "People are talking, Alara," the midwife said one afternoon when they crossed paths at the general store. "They're saying things that aren't kind. About you and Mr. Blake, about Thomas, and who's really raising him." "Let them talk." Alara kept her voice level as she selected vegetables, refusing to show how the words stung. "I'm doing nothing wrong. Rowan is helping me maintain my home. That's all." "Is it?" Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle but skeptical. "Because it looks like more than that to everyone who sees you together. And Alara, dear, I'm worried about you. About your reputation and Thomas's future. If people start to think that you and Mr. Blake are involved before there's been a proper courtship, a proper proposal." "My private life is my own business," Alara interrupted, more sharply than she'd intended. "And Thomas is thriving. He's healthy and happy and loved. That's what matters." "But who's loving him?" Mrs. Chen pressed. "You or the lumberjack who's playing at being his father? What happens when Mr. Blake gets tired of playing house and goes back to his mountain? What happens to Thomas then, when the man he's calling Da disappears?" The words hit like physical blows because they echoed Alara's own deepest fears. What if Rowan did leave? What if this was temporary, a diversion for a lonely man, and once the novelty wore off, he'd remember that he preferred solitude? "He won't leave," Alara said, trying to convince herself as much as Mrs. Chen. "He cares about us. Maybe he does, right now. But Alara, you barely know this man. He's been in the valley for 6 years and no one knows anything about him. Where he came from, what he's running from. He's not running from anything. He lost his family, his wife and son. He came here to grieve, and he's been grieving alone all this time." Alara's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "And now he's found a reason to stop grieving, to start living again. Is that so terrible?" Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "No, dear, it's not terrible, but it is fast. And people worry when things happen too fast. They worry about what comes after." "I appreciate your concern," Alara said stiffly, "but I can take care of myself and my son. I've been doing it for 14 months. "I know you have. You're a strong woman," Alara mourned. "Stronger than most. I just hope that strength is enough for what's coming." Mrs. Chen touched her arm gently. "Because the valley can be cruel when it decides someone has stepped outside the lines." Alara carried those words home with her, along with her purchases, and they weighed heavier than any supply sack. She found Rowan on a roof, replacing shingles that had come loose during a recent storm. Thomas was in his cradle on the porch, watching his Da work with fascinated attention. "You're back," Rowan called down when he spotted her. "How was town?" "Complicated," Alara admitted, setting down her parcels. "Mrs. Chen had some things to say about us. About our arrangement." Rowan climbed down from the roof with practiced ease, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I expect she wasn't complimentary." "She's worried about my reputation. about Thomas's future, about what will happen if... Alara stopped, unable to voice the fear. If I leave, Rowan finished for her. His expression was serious as he crossed to stand in front of her. Is that what you're afraid of? That I'll get bored and abandon you both? You have to admit it's a reasonable fear, Alara said defensively. We've known each other barely 3 months. People don't build lives together that quickly. They don't... Alara. He took her hands, his calloused fingers warm around hers. Look at me. She did, meeting those steady blue eyes. I'm not leaving, he said clearly. I'm not playing at this. I'm not going to wake up one morning and decide I prefer my lonely mountain to your company. This, you and Thomas, and this life we're building, this is real for me. The realest thing I've felt in 6 years. But how can you be sure? The words burst out of her. How can you know that this will last? That in a month or 6 months or a year, you won't regret tying yourself to a widow with a baby and a cabin that needs constant repairs? Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Come with me. I want to show you something. He led her inside to where he'd left his coat draped over a chair. From the inner pocket, he pulled out a small wooden box worn smooth with age. With careful fingers, he opened it. Inside was a lock of dark hair, tied with a faded ribbon, a woman's wedding ring, and a small baby's shoe, no bigger than Rowan's palm. This is all I have left of them, he said quietly. Sarah and Henry, yes, I named him Henry too. These bits of cloth and metal and hair. I've carried this box with me every day for 6 years, every single day. And for 6 years, I couldn't imagine caring about anything or anyone again. Couldn't imagine wanting to. He closed the box gently, then looked at Alara. 3 months ago, you walked up to me in that church and asked me to pretend to be your son's father. And I said yes because something in your desperation, your fierce love for Thomas, woke something in me that I thought had died. And every day since, that something has grown stronger. Until now, I don't know how to go back to who I was before. Tears were streaming down Alara's face now. Rowan, I'm not replacing Sarah and my Henry. Nothing could do that. But I'm also not going to spend the rest of my life mourning what I lost. I tried that. It nearly killed me. He touched her face gently, wiping away tears with his thumb. You and Thomas, you're not replacements. You're new. You're different. You're a second chance I never thought I'd get. And I'm not fool enough to walk away from that. I'm scared, Alara whispered. I'm so scared of loving you and losing you. I know, I'm scared too. His honesty was devastating. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe and alone. Wouldn't you? And when he put it like that, when he made it so simple and so clear, Alara found she had no argument left. She stepped into his arms, and he held her, and they stood there in the cabin while Thomas babbled contentedly on the porch and the afternoon sun painted everything gold. The valley is going to make things difficult, she said against his chest. Mrs. Chen was just the beginning. They'll talk and judge and possibly worse. Let them. Rowan's arms tightened around her. As long as we're honest with each other, what does their opinion matter? It might matter for Thomas, for his future here. Then we'll make sure he has a good future, together, however we need to do that. Alara pulled back slightly to look at him. What are you saying? I'm saying whatever the valley needs to see to accept this, to accept us, I'll do it. If that means a formal courtship with all the proper steps, fine. If it means something else, fine. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right in their eyes, so Thomas never suffers for our choices. The offer was more than Alara had dared hope for. You'd be willing to court me? Properly? With all the valley watching and judging every step? I'd be willing to marry you tomorrow if you'd have me, Rowan said bluntly. But I figure you might want some say in the timing. Alara's breath caught. Marry me? Why not? We're already living like a family, just without the blessing. Might as well make it legal, make it right in the eyes of God and the valley, and anyone else who cares to have an opinion. He studied her face carefully. Unless you're not ready for that. I'll wait if you need time. I'll wait as long as you need. It's been barely 3 months, Alara said, but her heart was racing with something that felt dangerously like joy. People will say we're rushing. They'll say I haven't mourned Henry properly. Do you love me? The question was direct, almost blunt, so very Rowan. Alara took a breath. Yes. God help me. Yes, I do. And I love you. I love Thomas like he's my own blood. So why wait? Why give the Valley more time to build stories about us that aren't true? Let's make it true. Let's make it real and legal and binding. You're serious? Alara searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation. Found none. You really want to marry me? I really want to marry you. Rowan's voice was steady, certain. I want to wake up here every morning instead of walking back to my empty cabin. I want to be Thomas's father in truth, not just in his baby words. I want to build a life with you, a real one, starting now. It was too fast, too soon. Every rule of propriety said she should wait, should have a proper mourning period, should let their relationship develop slowly and respectably. But Alara had learned the hard way that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, that waiting for the perfect time meant potentially losing all time. And she wanted this, wanted Rowan, wanted the family they'd been building in stolen moments and careful hope. Yes, she said, and watched joy transform his face. Yes, I'll marry you. When? Soon as it can be arranged. Rowan was actually smiling now, broad and unguarded. I'll talk to Reverend Ashford tomorrow, see what needs to be done. He's not going to be happy about this, Alara warned. He already thinks poorly of me after the baptism. Then he can think poorly while he performs the ceremony. I'm not asking his permission, just his service. Rowan cupped her face in both hands. Alara mourned, I know this is fast. I know it's unconventional, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Say you're sure too. I'm sure, Alara whispered, terrified but sure. Good. And then finally, Rowan bent his head and kissed her. It wasn't Alara's first kiss. That had been Henry's, young and eager and sweet. But this kiss was different. Rowan kissed her like she was precious, like she was a promise he was making with his whole body. His lips were gentle but sure against hers, his hands steady where they cupped her face. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing a little harder, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to make you happy, he said quietly. Going to make both of you happy. That's a promise. You already do, Alara replied, her hands coming up to cover his where they still held her face. Every day you're here, you do. They were interrupted by Thomas, who'd apparently decided he'd been ignored long enough and was making his displeasure known with increasingly loud protests. They broke apart laughing, and Rowan went to collect the baby while Alara started preparing dinner. Normal, domestic, perfect. That evening, after they'd eaten and Thomas had been put to bed, Rowan brought up the practicalities. I should talk to your late husband's family, anyone who might object to this marriage. There's no one close by, Alara said. Henry's parents are both gone, and his brother moved to California years ago. My own family is in Boston. I could write to them, but I doubt they'd come all this way. We were never close. What about friends? People in the valley who knew Henry. They'll want to have their say. Probably. Alara thought of the valley families, their judgment, and their gossip. But I don't need their permission, Rowan. I'm a grown woman. I can choose who I want to build a life with. I know. But for Thomas's sake, I want to do this as right as possible, so there's no question about his place in the community. About whether he's legitimate, whether he's accepted. Rowan's expression was serious. I want to adopt him properly, make him a Blake in name and in law, if you'll allow it. The offer stole Alara's breath. You want to adopt Thomas? Legally? I want him to be my son, in every way that matters. Rowan's voice roughened slightly. Want him to have my name, my protection. Want there to be no doubt in anyone's mind that I'm his father and he's my boy. But he's Henry's son, Alara said softly. I don't want Thomas to forget his real father. Don't want him to grow up thinking... He won't forget, Rowan interrupted gently. We'll tell him about Henry. Keep his memory alive. Make sure Thomas knows where he came from. But Alara, I'll be the father who raises him, who teaches him to walk and talk and work with his hands, who's there when he wakes from nightmares and when he takes his first steps and when he asks the hard questions. That's the father he'll know. And I want that to be recognized. It was everything Ilara hadn't dared hope for. Not just a husband for herself, but a true father for Thomas. Someone who wanted to claim her son not out of obligation, but out of love. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, you can adopt him. He'd be lucky to be a Blake. I'm the lucky one, Rowan said quietly. Getting a family when I thought that chance was gone forever. I won't take that for granted. Either of you. They sat together by the fire late into the night, making plans, discussing practicalities, occasionally just sitting in comfortable silence. It felt right in a way that nothing had felt right since Henry's death. It felt like coming home. But the next morning, when Rowan went to speak with Reverend Ashford about arranging the marriage, he returned to the cabin with a grim expression. What happened? Ilara asked, dread pooling in her stomach. The Reverend refused. Rowan's jaw was tight with suppressed anger. Said it was too soon, too improper. Said he wouldn't participate in what he called a disgrace to your late husband's memory. He refused to marry us? Ilara felt the shock of it like cold water. But he has to. It's his job. He said he'd reconsider in a year, maybe, if we can prove our relationship is respectable and God-fearing. Rowan's voice dripped with scorn. Whatever that means. A year? Ilara sank into a chair, feeling defeated. We can't wait a year. The gossip will tear us apart by then. And Thomas, I know. Rowan knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. But there are other options. There's a minister in the next valley over. We could go there, get married quietly, without the whole town watching. They'd never recognize it, Ilara said dully. The valley would claim it wasn't legitimate, wasn't proper. We'd be outcasts. We're already outcasts in their eyes. Rowan squeezed her hands. Ilara, I don't care what they think. I care what you think. What Thomas needs, and what we need, is to be a family, legal and recognized or not. Before Ilara could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Rowan stood, his body language immediately protective, and moved to answer it. A man stood on the porch, tall, well-dressed, with Ilara's late husband's dark hair and sharp features. She recognized him instantly, even though she hadn't seen him in nearly 3 years. Marcus, she breathed. Henry's brother, from California. What are you doing here? Marcus Morn looked past Rowan to where Ilara sat, his expression cold and assessing. I'm here because the Valley sent me a letter about my brother's widow and the unseemly situation she's gotten herself into. And I'm here to put a stop to it before she ruins my nephew's life completely. The confrontation Ilara had been dreading had finally arrived. The silence that followed Marcus Morn's declaration stretched taut as a bowstring. Ilara felt her blood turn to ice, while beside her Rowan's entire body had gone rigid, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You need to leave, Rowan said, his voice dangerously quiet. Right now. Marcus's gaze swept over Rowan with obvious disdain. And you must be the lumberjack, the one who's been living in sin with my brother's widow, pretending to be father to my brother's son. He turned his attention to Ilara. I'm disappointed in you, Ilara. I thought Henry married a woman with some sense of propriety. How dare you? Ilara found her voice, shock giving way to anger. You have no right to come here and judge me. You weren't here when Henry died. You weren't here when I had to bury him alone or when I gave birth to Thomas without family beside me. You weren't here for any of it. I'm here now. Marcus stepped past Rowan into the cabin uninvited, his expensive boots loud on the wooden floor. And I'm taking my nephew back to California with me, where he can be raised properly, away from this shameful situation. The words hit Ilara like a physical blow. You're not taking my son anywhere. He's not just your son. He's a Morn, my brother's heir. And I won't let you destroy his future by raising him in this. Marcus gestured around the humble cabin with obvious contempt. This squalor, with a man you've known for barely any time at all. Get out. Rowan's voice was still quiet, but there was steel beneath it now. You've said your piece. Now leave. I'm not leaving without the boy. Marcus pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. I've already filed papers with the territorial court. As Thomas's closest male relative and a man of means, I'm petitioning for custody. The hearing is in 2 weeks. Ilara's legs nearly gave out. Rowan moved to her side immediately, his arm coming around her waist to steady her. "You can't do this," she whispered. "He's my son. Mine. He's a child who deserves better than a mother who flaunts her indecency in front of the entire valley." Marcus's voice was cold, precise. "I have letters from concerned citizens, testimony from the minister himself about how you forced this man to participate in Thomas's baptism under false pretenses. Evidence of your relationship with Mr. Blake here, conducted without any regard for decent mourning or proper courtship." "We're getting married," Alara said desperately. "We were going to be married. That makes it proper, doesn't it?" "After how long? 3 months?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The law doesn't look kindly on widows who rush into new arrangements before their husband's grave has even settled. It suggests a certain moral flexibility that isn't suitable for raising children." "I've been alone for 14 months, Alara shot back. 14 months of managing by myself, keeping Thomas fed and safe and loved. I've done everything right, everything proper, until you decided propriety didn't matter anymore, Seek," Marcus finished. "Until you decided your own desires were more important than your son's reputation. Tell me, Alara, what kind of future do you think Thomas will have growing up known as the widow's bastard, raised by a hermit nobody knows anything about?" "Don't talk about him like that." Rowan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You don't know anything about us, about what we've built here." "I know enough." Marcus's gaze raked over Rowan dismissively. "I know you're a drifter who showed up in this valley 6 years ago with no history, no family, no references. I know you've been living as a hermit ever since. And I know that no reputable court is going to award custody to a woman who's shacked up with someone like you." "We are not shacked up," Alara said through gritted teeth. "Rowan has been helping me maintain my home, that's all." "Is it?" Marcus's smile was cruel. "Then why is there a child's chair with Thomas's name carved into it, sitting by your table? Why does the baby reach for this man and call him Da? Why has he been seen leaving your cabin at all hours, sometimes staying overnight?" Alara's face flushed. "Thomas was sick. Rowan stayed to help me care for him. There was nothing improper about it. That's not how the valley sees it, and it's not how the court will see it either." Marcus folded his arms. "I'm offering you a way out of this, Alara. Sign custody over to me willingly, and I'll make sure Thomas is raised with every advantage. Good schools, respectable society, a proper future. Refuse, and I'll drag you through a court battle that will expose every indiscretion, every improper moment. And you'll lose anyway, because no judge is going to side with you when I present the evidence I have." "Evidence?" Rowan's voice was sharp. "What evidence?" "Testimony from multiple valley residents about your cohabitation. The minister's statement about the false baptism. The doctor's record showing that Mr. Blake here paid for Thomas's medical care, acting as the father, when he has no legal right to do so." Marcus's smile widened. "Shall I go on?" Alara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything they'd done out of love, out of necessity, was being twisted into something ugly and shameful. "Please," she said, hating the pleading in her voice but unable to stop it. "Please don't do this. Thomas needs me. What he needs is a stable home with a married couple who can provide for him properly, which you are not." Marcus moved toward the cradle where Thomas was just beginning to stir from his nap. "I'll be back in 2 weeks with the court order. In the meantime, I suggest you prepare yourself for the inevitable." Rowan moved faster than Alara had ever seen him move, positioning himself between Marcus and the cradle. "You're not touching him." For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across Marcus's face. Rowan was taller, broader, and right now he looked like he was barely restraining himself from violence. "Are you threatening me?" Marcus asked, but he'd stopped advancing. "I'm telling you that if you try to take that baby right now, we're going to have a problem. A big one." Rowan's voice was steady, but his eyes were ice cold. "You have your court date. Fine. We'll see you there. But until a judge says otherwise, Thomas stays with his mother. Am I clear?" Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then adjusted his coat with an annoyed gesture. 2 weeks, Alara. I suggest you use that time to consider what's really best for your son. Because this man," he jerked his head toward Rowan, "he's going to cost you everything." He swept out of the cabin, leaving a wake of devastation behind him. The moment the door closed, Alara's knees buckled. Rowan caught her, lowering them both to the floor, and she buried her face in his chest and finally let herself fall apart. "He's going to take Thomas," she sobbed. "He's going to take my baby, and there's nothing I can do to stop him." "The hell there isn't!" Rowan's arms were tight around her, his voice fierce. "We're going to fight this. We're going to fight it with everything we have." "How?" "You heard him. He has testimony, evidence, the minister on his side. What do we have?" "We have the truth. We have the fact that you're Thomas's mother, and you've been taking care of him perfectly well. We have the fact that I love you both, and I'm not going anywhere." Rowan pulled back enough to look at her face. "And we have 2 weeks to figure out how to prove it." But over the next 3 days, as they tried to build their case, Alara's hope dwindled. Every door they knocked on seemed to close in their faces. The lawyer in town refused to take their case once he heard Marcus Morn was involved. Reverend Ashford doubled down on his condemnation, declaring publicly that Alara had brought shame on herself, and that perhaps Marcus was right, perhaps Thomas would be better off elsewhere. Even people who'd once been friendly, who'd bought eggs from her or traded services, suddenly had nothing to say to her. The valley had made its judgment, and that judgment was harsh. "They've already decided," Alara said dully on the third night, watching Thomas sleep peacefully in his cradle, unaware that his whole world was about to be torn apart. "Marcus has convinced them I'm unfit, and maybe he's right." "Don't say that." Rowan's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare say that." "But look at the situation objectively, Rowan. I'm a widow who let a man I barely knew into my life and my home. I let Thomas get attached to you. I let myself get attached to you. And now he's going to lose you, and it's my fault for not being more careful, for not thinking about the consequences." "Stop!" Rowan grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You did nothing wrong. You survived. You accepted help when you needed it. You let yourself be happy again. Those aren't crimes, Alara. Those are the actions of a strong woman doing her best in impossible circumstances." "But it's not enough. My best isn't enough to keep my son." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if we did what Marcus is doing? What if we fought with every weapon we have?" "We don't have any weapons. We're nobody. He has money, connections, the law on his side. We have something he doesn't." Rowan's expression was intense. "We have the fact that we love Thomas, that we know him, that we're the ones who've been caring for him every single day." He stood pacing the small cabin. "And we have the fact that if we were married, properly, legally married, before that court date, it would be a lot harder for Marcus to claim you're unfit. But Reverend Ashford refused to marry us. And if we go to another valley, the marriage won't be recognized here. Then we make him change his mind." Rowan's jaw was set with determination. "We make the whole damn valley change their minds. We show them that we're not the scandal they think we are, that we're a family, and we deserve to stay together." "How do we do that?" "By being visible, by being undeniable." Rowan knelt beside her chair. "Starting tomorrow, I'm moving in here, properly. Not sneaking away at night, not pretending we're just friends who share meals. I'm going to be here as Thomas's father and your partner, and I'm going to dare anyone to say it's wrong." "That'll make things worse," Alara protested. "That'll give Marcus exactly the ammunition he needs. Or it'll show the valley that we're serious, that this isn't some sordid affair, but two people building a real life together. Sometimes the only way to fight scandal is to refuse to be scandalized." Rowan took her hands. "Trust me. Please. I've got an idea, but I need you to trust me." Alara looked at this man who'd come into her life so unexpectedly, who'd given her hope when she'd had none, who loved her son like his own. And she realized she did trust him, completely. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" The next morning, Rowan Blake walked into the center of the valley with his head high and his purpose clear. He went straight to the general store, where he knew the most gossips would be gathered, and he announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "I'm here to buy supplies for my family, for my wife-to-be, Alara Morn, and my son, Thomas. And I want everyone here to know that I'm proud to be building a life with them, proud to be a father to that boy. And anyone who has a problem with it can say so to my face." The store went dead silent. Mrs. Sullivan stood frozen with a bolt of fabric in her hands. The Brennan boys stared with wide eyes. Even Mr. Jameson, the store owner, looked shocked. Then, into that silence, a voice spoke up from the back of the store. "I don't have a problem with it." Everyone turned. Mrs. Chen, the midwife, stepped forward. Her expression was serious, but not unkind. "I've been thinking about what I said to you, Alara, and I was wrong. Wrong to judge, wrong to add to your burdens. You're a good mother, and Mr. Blake here has shown more dedication to that child than some blood fathers I've seen." "Now wait just a minute," Mrs. Sullivan started, but Mrs. Chen cut her off. "No, you wait. We've all been so busy gossiping and judging that we forgot what matters. That baby is healthy and loved. Alara is managing against odds that would have broken most of us. And Mr. Blake has done nothing but help her. Where's the sin in that? Where's the shame? The impropriety," Mrs. Sullivan sputtered. "The impropriety is in us," Mrs. Chen said firmly, "in the way we've treated a young widow who was just trying to survive, in the way we've made her feel ashamed for accepting help. I'm done with it. And if Reverend Ashford won't marry them, I'll stand as witness and advocate to any court that will listen that this is a family that deserves to stay together." "I'll stand too," said a voice from the doorway. Young Mr. Cooper, whose family Henry had died trying to save, stepped into the store. "Mr. Morn gave his life for my family. The least I can do is stand up for his widow and his son. If Rowan Blake is willing to be a father to that boy, then I say we should be thanking him, not condemning him." "And me," said Mrs. Brennan, surprising everyone including her own sons. "I've been watching them in town, the way he is with the baby, the way he looks at Alara. That's not sin, that's love. And we could use more of it in this valley, if you ask me." One by one, more voices spoke up. Not everyone. Mrs. Sullivan and her closest friends remained tight-lipped and disapproving. But enough. Enough that the tide began to turn. That afternoon, a delegation of Valley residents marched to Reverend Ashford's home. Led by Mrs. Chen and Mr. Cooper, they requested, politely but firmly, that the Reverend reconsider his position on marrying Alara and Rowan. "The Valley needs to stand together," Mrs. Chen told him, "and that means supporting our own instead of tearing them down. Marcus Morn hasn't been here. He doesn't know this community. But we do. And we're telling you that Alara and Rowan deserve our support, not our judgment." Reverend Ashford, faced with a united front from his own congregation, reluctantly agreed to perform the ceremony. "But," he insisted, "it must be done properly, with witnesses, with the full blessing of the church. I won't have anyone saying I sanctioned something shameful." "It won't be shameful," Rowan promised. "It'll be honest. That's all we want." The wedding was arranged for the following Sunday, exactly 1 week before the custody hearing. It would be small and simple, but it would be legal and recognized. It would make them a family in the eyes of the law. But Marcus Morn wasn't finished fighting. 3 days before the wedding, he appeared at the cabin again, this time with a sheriff's deputy in tow. "I'm filing an emergency petition," Marcus announced. "Based on evidence of cohabitation and moral unfitness, I'm requesting immediate temporary custody pending the hearing." Alara felt her world tilt. "You can't." "I can and I am." Marcus nodded to the deputy. "Take the child." "Like hell." Rowan positioned himself in front of the cradle again, and this time the deputy's hand moved to his gun. "Mr. Blake, I don't want trouble," the deputy said. "But I have a court order here. If you interfere, then what? You'll shoot me in front of a baby?" Rowan's voice was steady, but Alara could see the tension in every line of his body. "That the kind of man you are, Deputy Carson?" The deputy looked uncomfortable. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to protect children, isn't it? So look at that baby. Really look at him. Does he look neglected, abused, unloved?" Rowan's voice rang with conviction. "That boy is healthy and happy. He's been cared for better than half the children in this valley. And you want to rip him away from his mother and give him to a stranger from California based on gossip and moral judgment?" Deputy Carson hesitated, his hand falling away from his gun. "Mr. Morn has legal standing. Mr. Morn has money and connections. That's not the same as legal standing." Rowan pulled a paper from his own pocket. "This is a statement from Dr. Morrison attesting to Thomas's excellent health and care. And this," he pulled out another paper, "is a petition signed by 20 Valley residents stating that Alara Morn is a fit mother and that Marcus Morn's claims are without merit. The deputy took the papers, scanning them with obvious surprise. I didn't know. No, you didn't. Because Marcus Morn told you his version and you believed him without asking questions. Rowan's voice softened slightly. I'm asking you to wait. 1 week, that's all. In 1 week, Alara and I will be married. We'll be a legally recognized family. And then Marcus Morn's arguments about her moral fitness go away. 1 week. Can you give us that? Deputy Carson looked between Rowan, Alara, and Marcus Morn. Then he looked at Thomas, who'd woken up and was staring at all the strangers with wide, frightened eyes. 1 week, the deputy said finally. But Mr. Morn, you should know, if these papers are legitimate and if they do marry, your case for custody is going to be a lot weaker. They won't marry, Marcus said confidently. Reverend Ashford won't perform the ceremony. I've made sure of it. Actually, came a new voice from the doorway, I will. Everyone turned. Reverend Ashford stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable but determined. Behind him stood Mrs. Chen, Mr. Cooper, and at least a dozen other Valley residents. I've been reminded, the Reverend said stiffly, that my duty is to minister to my congregation, not to judge them. And this congregation has made it clear that they support this union. So, yes, Mr. Morn, I will be performing the ceremony this Sunday as scheduled. Marcus's face went red with fury. You'll regret this, all of you. When I win custody and take that boy to California, you'll all remember that you chose the wrong side. We chose the side of love and family, Mrs. Chen said quietly, and I don't think we'll regret that. Marcus stormed out, and the deputy followed with an apologetic shrug. The moment they were gone, Alara collapsed into Rowan's arms, shaking with reaction. It's going to be all right, Rowan murmured into her hair. We're going to get through this. Together. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Alara had no money for a fancy dress, so Mrs. Brennan lent her one, simple but pretty, cream-colored with lace at the collar. Mrs. Chen offered to watch Thomas during the ceremony, but Alara insisted he be there. He's part of this, she said. He should be there when we become a family. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Alara woke early, her stomach a knot of nerves and anticipation. Today she would marry Rowan Blake. Today they would become a legal family. And in 1 week they would face Marcus Morn in court and fight for their right to stay together. The church was more crowded than Alara had expected. Word had spread, and Valley residents who'd shunned her for weeks now filled the pews, wanting to witness this unlikely union. Some were there out of genuine support, others out of curiosity, but they were there. Rowan stood at the altar in his best clothes, still work-worn but clean and pressed. His hair was neatly trimmed, his jaw freshly shaved, and when Alara walked down the aisle with Thomas in her arms, Rowan's expression transformed into something so full of love and wonder that it took her breath away. The ceremony was short and simple. Reverend Ashford kept to the traditional words, his voice steady, if not warm. When it came time for the vows, Rowan took Thomas from Alara's arms so she could place her hand in his. Do you, Alara Morn, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? I do, Alara said clearly, her voice not wavering. And do you, Rowan Blake, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? I do, Rowan said, his eyes never leaving Alara's face. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory and by God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Blake, you may kiss your bride. Rowan leaned in and kissed her gently, sweetly, while Thomas, perched on Rowan's hip, patted both their faces with his small hands as if giving his own blessing. The congregation broke into applause, and for the first time in 14 months, Alara felt something other than grief in a church. She felt hope. The week before the custody hearing passed in a strange mixture of bliss and dread. Alara was married now, wearing a simple gold band that Rowan had carved himself from a piece of oak and then plated at the jeweler's. They were a family legally, and Rowan had formally filed papers to adopt Thomas. But Marcus Morn was still out there, still determined to take Thomas away. And nobody knew which way the judge would rule. The morning of the hearing, Alara dressed carefully in her best dress and braided her hair with shaking fingers. Rowan, beside her, was quiet and focused as he prepared. Thomas, sensing the tension, was fussy and clingy. "Whatever happens," Rowan said as they prepared to leave for the courthouse, "we fight. We don't give up. Agreed?" "Agreed," Alara whispered. The courtroom in the territorial courthouse was smaller than Alara had expected, wood-paneled and austere. Judge Morrison, no relation to the doctor, was an older man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. He listened as Marcus Morn's lawyer presented their case, detailing Alara's relationship with Rowan, the speed of their marriage, the questionable circumstances of their courtship. Then it was their turn. Rowan had found them a lawyer, Mr. Patterson, an older man who'd agreed to take their case after hearing their story. He presented their documentation, the marriage certificate, the petition from Valley residents, Dr. Morrison's medical assessment of Thomas, character witnesses. "Your Honor," Mr. Patterson said, "what we have here is not a case of neglect or unfitness. We have a young widow who lost her husband tragically and found herself alone with an infant son. She did what any strong woman would do. She survived. She maintained her home, cared for her child, and yes, eventually accepted help from a good man who'd also suffered loss. Mr. Blake and Mrs. Blake," he emphasized the new name, "are now legally married and have the support of their community. Thomas is thriving in their care. Mr. Marcus Morn, while a blood relative, is essentially a stranger to this child. He has no relationship with Thomas, hasn't visited until now, and his sudden interest in custody seems motivated more by family pride than genuine concern for the child's welfare." Marcus's lawyer fired back, but Judge Morrison held up a hand. "I'd like to hear from Mrs. Blake herself." Alara's heart hammered as she stood. "Your Honor, I know our situation looks unconventional. I know people have judged me for accepting Rowan's help, for marrying quickly, for a lot of things, but everything I've done has been for Thomas, to give him a stable home, a loving family, a future. Rowan didn't just help me repair my cabin or split wood. He gave my son a father, something Thomas desperately needed, and something Rowan needed too, after losing his own family. We've built something real together, something that matters. And yes, it happened fast, but when you've lost as much as we have, you learn not to waste time when you find something worth holding on to." Judge Morrison studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Marcus. "Mr. Morn, why do you want custody of your nephew?" Marcus stood, his posture confident. "To provide him with opportunities his mother cannot. Education, society, a proper upbringing in a respectable household." "I see. And where is this household?" "California. I have a successful business there, a large home. So you'd be taking the child away from his mother, away from the valley where he was born, away from everyone he knows, to live with an uncle he's never met." The judge's tone was neutral, but something in it made Marcus hesitate. "For his own good, yes." "His own good or yours?" Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Morn, I've read the depositions from Valley residents. I've reviewed the medical records. I've examined the evidence of the Blakes' marriage and home situation. And I have to say, I'm struggling to see what the child gains by being removed from a loving home and placed with a relative who, by all accounts, has shown no prior interest in his welfare. Your Honor, there is no impropriety. They're married, legally and properly. The circumstances of their courtship may have been unusual, but I see no evidence of harm to the child." Judge Morrison looked at Thomas, who was nestled against Rowan's chest, one small hand fisted in his father's shirt. "In fact, that child looks remarkably content exactly where he is." Hope flickered in Alara's chest, almost painful in its intensity. "Mr. Morn," the judge continued, "I'm going to make my ruling now. After reviewing all the evidence and testimony, I find no grounds for removing Thomas Blake. Note the name as Mr. Blake's adoption petition is hereby approved, from his mother's custody. Mrs. Blake has demonstrated herself to be a capable, loving parent. Mr. Blake has shown dedication to the child's welfare and has the support of their community. Meanwhile, you, sir, have shown up with legal papers but no genuine relationship with the boy. Custody remains with the parents. Case dismissed." The gavel fell, and for a moment Alara couldn't process what had happened. Then Rowan was pulling her into his arms, Thomas squished between them, and she realized they'd won. They'd actually won. Marcus Morn stood rigid with fury. "This is not over." "Yes, it is," Judge Morrison said firmly. "And Mr. Morn, if you continue to harass this family, I'll hold you in contempt. They've done nothing wrong. Accept it and move on." Marcus stared at them for a long moment, his expression venomous. Then he turned and stalked from the courtroom without another word. Outside, in the summer sunshine, the small group of Valley residents who'd come to support them broke into cheers. Mrs. Chen hugged Alara tightly. Mr. Cooper shook Rowan's hand with enthusiasm. Even Reverend Ashford offered his stiff congratulations. "You did it," Mrs. Chen said, smiling through tears. "You fought for your family and you won." "We all did it," Alara corrected, looking at the faces around her, people who'd chosen to support them when it would have been easier to look away. "Thank you, all of you." That evening, back at the cabin that was now truly their home, Alara and Rowan sat together on the porch while Thomas played at their feet with the wooden toys Rowan had carved. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and everything felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in months. "I was thinking," Rowan said slowly, "about what happens next. My cabin on the mountain. It's bigger than this one. More room for Thomas as he grows. We could move there, or we could build something new, something that's ours from the beginning." "I like it here," Alara said. "This is where I first learned to survive on my own, where you first came to help me, where we became a family. It feels right to stay." "Then we stay, and we'll build onto it. Add a proper bedroom for Thomas, maybe expand the kitchen, make it big enough for the life we're building." He paused. "Maybe big enough for more than just the three of us eventually." Alara's breath caught. "More? If you want. No rush. But someday, maybe. Brothers or sisters for Thomas, a house full of noise and life." Rowan looked almost shy, suggesting it. "If that's something you'd want." "I'd want that," Alara said softly. "Very much." Thomas chose that moment to toddle over. He'd just started taking real steps in the past week and pull himself up on Rowan's knee. "Papa," he said clearly, distinctly, not baby babble anymore, but a real word, a real name for the man who'd become his father. Rowan's eyes went bright with tears. He scooped Thomas up and held him close, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "That's right, little one. I'm your papa. Always will be." Alara leaned against Rowan's shoulder, one hand on her son's back, and felt something she hadn't felt since before Henry died. Complete. Not the completion that comes from having no problems or struggles, they'd have plenty of those ahead, but the completion that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be, with exactly the people you're meant to be with. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "what would have happened if I hadn't walked up to you in that church? If I just left after the Reverend refused to baptize Thomas?" "I wonder," Rowan admitted, "and then I thank God you were brave enough to ask. Desperate enough or crazy enough or whatever it was that made you approach a stranger and trust him with something so important." "I think I knew," Alara said. "Even then, something in me recognized something in you, knew you'd understand, knew you'd help. I'm glad you trusted that instinct." Rowan shifted Thomas to a more comfortable position, the baby's head drooping as sleep overtook him. "Because that moment, you asking me to pretend to be Thomas's father, that was the moment my life started again. I just didn't know it yet." They sat together as the sun finished setting, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Thomas slept peacefully against his father's chest. The forest around them settled into its nighttime rhythms, and inside the small cabin, lamps glowed warmly, promising comfort and safety and home. "I love you," Alara said, simple and true. "I love you too," Rowan replied. "Both of you. My family." His family. The words that had once belonged to people lost to fever and grief now belonged to new people, new love, new life. The past would always be part of them. Henry's memory would live on in Thomas, and Sarah and little Henry would always have a place in Rowan's heart. But the past didn't have to define them anymore. They had built something new from their shared losses, had created a family, not from blood or obligation, but from choice and courage and love that grew in unlikely soil. A week later, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, the valley gathered for a celebration at the Blake homestead. It wasn't quite a wedding reception, that had been too hurried to include festivities, but rather a welcoming. An acknowledgement that Rowan Blake was no longer the hermit on the mountain, and Alara was no longer the widow struggling alone. And together they were a family the valley could embrace. There was food and music and children running through the clearing while adults talked and laughed. Thomas, dressed in new clothes, misses. Brennan had sewn, held court in his father's arms, charming everyone with his smiles and his increasingly clear attempts at words. "He's going to be a talker," Mrs. Chen predicted, tickling Thomas under the chin. "Mark my words. Won't be able to get him to hush in another year or two." "Good," Rowan said. "House is too quiet anyway. Could use some noise." Alara watched from the porch, her heart full almost to bursting. All of this, had seemed impossible just months ago. She'd been so alone, so desperate, so certain that she and Thomas would always be outsiders. And then she'd found the courage to ask a stranger for help. And that stranger had said yes. Such a simple thing, such a complicated thing. One word that had changed 3 lives forever. "You look happy," Rowan said, coming to stand beside her while Mrs. Chen entertained Thomas. "I am happy. Terrified sometimes, waiting for something to go wrong. But happy." Alara took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Thank you. For saying yes. For staying. For becoming exactly what we needed." "Thank you for asking," Rowan replied. "For trusting me. For giving me a reason to be more than just a man in the woods waiting for his life to be over." Thomas's laugh rang out across the clearing, pure and joyful and utterly without guile. The sound of a child who knew he was loved, who felt safe, who would grow up surrounded by family and community. "He's going to have a good life," Alara said. "Isn't he?" "The best we can give him," Rowan promised. "Together. Together." The word that had once meant Alara and Henry, that had briefly meant just Alara and Thomas, now meant something bigger. A family built from ruins and hope, from desperate questions and steady answers, from loss transformed into love. The sun set over the valley, casting everything in golden light. And in the small cabin at the edge of the forest, the Blake family, born from a widow's desperation and a lumberjack's loneliness, began their life together. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be hard times ahead, challenges to face, struggles to overcome, but they would face them together. A family not in spite of their pasts, but because of them. Stronger for what they'd survived. Grateful for what they'd found. And years later, when Thomas was old enough to understand, they would tell him the story of how his family began, how his mother was brave enough to ask a stranger for help, how that stranger looked at a desperate widow and her baby son and decided to stay, how love, real love, often begins with a single word, yes.